Hello, and welcome to another TMRN, Time Monk Radio Network production. I'm McLaren, and today is Saturday, March 31st, 2012. Carl Gustav Jung developed an understanding of archetypes as being ancient or archaic images that derive from the collective unconscious. There are many different types of archetypes, and Jung has stated they are limitless. For Jung, quote, "The archetype is the introspectively recognizable form of a priori psychic orderedness," end quote. These images must be thought of as lacking in solid content, hence as unconscious. They are only acquired solidity, influence, and eventual consciousness in the encounter with empirical facts. The archetypes form a dynamic substratum common to all humanity, upon the foundation of which each individual builds their own experience of life, developing a unique array of psychological characteristics. Joining us today is Jonathan Zapp. Jonathan's website is zapporacle.com. On it, you will find many of his writings, podcasts, interviews, and more. Jonathan is a photographer, author, teacher, paranormal researcher, and philosopher who has written extensively on psychology and contemporary mythology. Jonathan has done numerous radio and television interviews, including 4 three-hour shows on Coast to Coast AM. He is a published author of articles, essays, and books. His most recent work is Crossing the Event Horizon, Human Metamorphosis, and the Singularity Archetype. This book was just recently released. Jonathan's first experience with the Singularity Archetype is described in his book. The book is quite an interesting read that draws upon Jungian archetypes, media of the last 60 years or so, shared, though uncommon experience expressed at the individual level, and Jonathan's analytical skills. Hello, Jonathan, and welcome to the Time Monk Radio Roundtable.
Great to be here.
The Time Monk administrator is Fox, and today he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us for this discussion. They include members Chipper Dog, Disaster Cat, Mama Bear, and Uranus Rising. Again, Jonathan's website is zapporacle.com. This interview will be available for free at timemonkradio.com, on YouTube at the Time Monk Radio channel, and the website webbotforum.com. Are you ready to begin, Jonathan?
Yes, I am.
Okay, terrific. Our discussion today will be broken into several topic areas, the first of which is the Singularity Archetype. For the first question, we turn to Disaster Cat.
Hi, Jonathan. This is Disaster Cat, and my question is there a simplified definition of the Singularity Archetype that could be useful in getting a quick understanding of what these words mean? I realize you wrote an entire book on the subject, but I keep trying to define it in my mind, and I'm having a bit of difficulty pinning it down. Thank you.
Okay. There's no puzzle about why you're having trouble pinning it down, because archetypes, to some extent, cannot be fully pinned down because they are. We can sort of improve the signal to noise ratio by looking at many different versions of the archetype and seeing what they all have in common, or what most of them have in common, and stripping away idiosyncrasies that are particular to any one of them. But they are sort of like multidimensional objects, but also subjects. They are considered living agencies that can have their own intentions. So that's why they can be pretty hard to pin down. But just as the famous book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, just as he saw all these common characteristics of the hero cycle, if you look at enough versions of it, you can start to get an idea of what it's all about. And so the Singularity Archetype, which can show up in dreams, it can show up in religious prophecies and saucer cults and science fiction, usually presents itself as a shocking event. It's an event that'll be sort of a rupture of plane kind of thing. It may seem like the end of the world or something absolutely disastrous, but from the ego perspective, and in some versions that may be the only perspective on it, but in more complete versions, it's then also seen from the point of view of the self as Jung defined it the totality of psychic structures. And then it will, what appeared to be a disaster or Armageddon will be revealed as a transcendent evolutionary event. And some of the things that are often connected to that revelation are spiral motifs, eyes, strange lights, and a type of telepathy will often be involved, a visual telepathy. And we may find that certain individuals who may cross this event horizon first may have great powers of a parapsychological nature, and that may even threaten the patriarchal order. And this is something that can be experienced culturally or through a dream, or people may have encounters with it that have certain experiential and empirical aspects that are even verifiable, like with near-death experience, because it applies to two two kind of event horizons. One is the eschaton, or the end of the species, and every species has a certain limited lifespan. The average lifespan is, for a species, about 1 million years. For a mammalian species, 100,000 is the average for all species. And of course, we're doing our best to lower that average, but that's a general rule. So it's always a matter of time before the species reaches that end. And then the individual is kind of like a fractal. The small part recapitulates the whole. So the individual life cycle recapitulates the life cycle of the species. And therefore, for the individual, death is the event horizon. And in fact, when people have near-death experiences, they will often experience all the things discussed, including the visual telepathy and the spirals and many of the other motifs that you associate with the singularity archetype.
Wow, Jonathan, thank you very much. That really, really helps clear things up. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, welcome.
The next question will be from Uranus Rising.
Hi, Jonathan. In your book, you've written about the 5 aspects of evil of the singularity archetype. Could you describe these aspects and what the amplification of these is indicative of at this time?
Okay. Well, one of the aspects that relates to evil is archetypal possession. And this is something that can happen with any archetype, is people become obsessed with it and possessed by it. And this is something you see throughout the New Age, for example,
Yes.
is that people may have actual contact with an archetype, but an enormous inflation goes on because the archetypes have enormous energy. So it will inflate their ego. They may be filled with a messianic fervor and a strong, feverish desire to proselytize, and this can lead to things like the Heaven's Gate scenario, where we saw every aspect of the singularity archetype play out, and it in a very unfortunate, tragic kind of way.
Sure.
So archetype possession is a big part of it, and we see this also in that recurrent habit of the human mind of apocalypticism, where an end date is imagined, but it's imagined in a way that has unfortunate consequences, where people feel they're part of a select group, and they have all kinds of things that will sort of boost up their sense of themselves, and they'll attach to a specific end date and this kind of thing, and may, unfortunate things can often happen with that. There's been a lot of blood spilled in the name of the book of Revelation of the Bible. So that's another one of the aspects. I'm just taking a look in the book to see what else happens. Another aspect of why darkness needs to be involved with the singularity archetype is that when novelty intensifies, then from my point of view, and I think it sort of relates to Taoism and just the idea of the yin and yang, then the outer edge of light and the outer edge of dark must both also intensify. It's kind of like a Tom Robbins character said, you don't get a big top without a big bottom. A third aspect has to do with xenophobia. And we have a very strong, even amongst our own species, we are powerfully xenophobic. Some people don't like gays, or they don't like people of particular races or religions. And some evolutionary biologists have even suggested that maybe this intense xenophobia we have, they call it pseudo-speciation, that, it's now believed that at the same time early Homo sapiens were around, there were other hominid species like Neanderthals around, and that we may have been the last hominid standing, so to speak, because we killed off the others. And therefore, we may have an ancestral primordial expectation that if there are new species that are somewhat like us, that we're in a zero-sum game battle with them of life and death. So if there is a new form, it may be reacted to, the old type may react to it immunologically and want it destroyed. And we kind of see this with a lot of political developments. I think this may be going on with the exacerbation of the mistreatment of women in Islamic fundamentalist regimes. It seems that where women are making progress elsewhere in the world, that causes those who would rather remain in the 7th century to actually become even worse and to become exacerbated. It's like a paradoxical effect. So I think that's another aspect where things may go badly wrong. And we also see a battle between, in many of the mythological versions of the singularity archetype, especially in science fiction, a common theme is the patriarchal / military industrial complex versus the mutant, where you have these two great power structures and they view each other as threats. And perhaps the military industrial complex is more reasonably viewed as a threat because it's of its nature to be threatening and to lay down the law and to establish a control system. But when we have a new human type that has parapsychological abilities, that's very threatening. I mean, the secrecy is a key to a military industrial complex, but if you have somebody that can pierce secrecy with their psychic abilities, for example, then that's a direct threat. And finally, the fifth aspect is that power corrupts, and weaponized parapsychic power corrupts absolutely. If there are new abilities developed, that means that's a form of power. With any new type of communication or consciousness, they both go together. If you have a new, if consciousness changes, communication changes. If you have a new modality of communication, consciousness changes. And we, even though our bodies look rather puny compared to some of the other animals out there, we are by far the dominant animal on the planet because of those very things. So even though these might seem like etherealized changes, they may make some who have crossed that event horizon and have developed these abilities far more powerful, and that will be seen as, and maybe will be, a threat to others. And although when I've talked to Terence McKenna and Ram Dass about my theories years ago, they thought that it would eliminate evil in a sense, that they saw similar things happening, but they thought people would become aware through this sort of global telepathy that there's only one of us or something, and that would reduce the possibility of evil. But I actually disagree with them. I think that power, darkness seems to be a very ubiquitous principle, and the ability to use visual communication, for example, can turn into the devil that hath the power to assume a pleasing shape. Just like there are many versions, technological evolution parallels organic evolution, and there are many versions of some of the wonderful technological changes we're getting in which you would see that very the devil has the power to assume a pleasing shape thing play out. I mean, just like we saw on a fantasy level with the T-1000 Terminator and the Terminator 2, that's a liquid metal Terminator that can take on any form. But it's within present technology. I mean, it's not maybe happening yet or been pulled off yet. But for example, a politician could broadcast an image of himself, and through computer modification, say if he's broadcasting it to an Hispanic area, throw in 10% of an Hispanic face and mix that in with his, because it's been shown that people will vote for people that look more like them. And they might even be able to do that so that they look You know, in an Irish neighborhood, maybe they'll look more Irish, and in a Chinese neighborhood, they'll look vaguely Asian, and so forth. And so these are the kind of ways that the type of visual communication that I call logos beheld, these are ways in which it could be used for evil just with present technology. When it's available in a more organic form, I'm sure it will have its dark uses as well.
Well, thank you for that. And I think it's really, really important that we're all consciously aware of this and can get our minds wrapped around it and be more educated about it. And also exploring some darkness here. Predation, parasitism, symbiosis. Would you describe how these dynamics play out both on a mental and energetic level?
Well, these are classic relationships of energetic transaction, and we basically see them play out everywhere. We see them, where I've written about it is in kind of another strange topic called the mind parasites. And, you know, wherever we find life, we find these three classic relationships of symbiosis, my favorite, parasitism, and predation. And it's perfectly possible for us to miss an entire dimension or realm of life. For example, every culture missed the whole microbiological plane. You know, surgeons were washing their hands after surgery, but not before. It wasn't until a Danish shopkeeper, A.V. Leeuwenhoek, in the 17th century, ground the first lenses that were good enough to see an amoeba, you know, a relative giant to the microbiological world in a very primitive microscope, that we suddenly started to realize, like, wow, there's this whole dimension of life going on, and it's not just out there, it's in here. If you were to tell somebody before A.V. Leeuwenhoek that actually your body is made of 50 trillion of these little animals, you know, that are complex enough to be carrying on 100,000 operations a second each, that would be just too mind-boggling for anybody to comprehend it. We've all been born into that world where the microbiological is taken for granted. But there is another realm of life besides the macro life of the plants and animals, the flora and fauna that we can see with our eyes, and the microbiological, and that's the realm of energetic organisms. And this has been recognized by every single human culture throughout time, including Christianity. They would talk about the incubi and the succubi. The only one that denies it or that hasn't recognized it is Western scientism, scientific fundamentalist materialism. And
right.
And when we look at those, the testimony from people from many different cultures, including our own, about how these energetic organisms behave, we notice the same relationships of energetic transactions, symbiosis, predation, and parasitism. And so many cultures recognize this. For example, in Ayurveda, the traditional medicine of India, the study of disincarnate parasitic organisms and their effect on health was considered on a par with gynecology or any other important medical subspecialty. In Chinese medicine and acupuncture, there are some 517, I probably have the number wrong, energetic meridians or points, and I think something like 37 of them have the prefix que in front of them, and that means disincarnate spirit. Those are points where disincarnate spirits could feed off of energy, and then the Buddhists called them pritas or hungry ghosts, and every culture had some kind of name for those. Right.
And what about with sensitives? Don't they see what's happening on an energetic level? And I also wonder if this is maybe where we're moving towards as we approach the singularity archetype.
Well, many do say that they see them, and if you Qigong practitioners and so forth will say that, and many others. Now, of course, evaluating their veracity, that's something I would like to see more tests done. For example, have somebody examined by different practitioners and who have no contact with each other and no access to the same database, and see if they all agree that this person's parasite is on their left shoulder or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be interesting to test that. I think it's completely possible that this is happening, but I'm still want to be careful and not, give veracity to something that I haven't really tested myself or seen rigorously tested.
Yeah. And do you think this is going on both at a personal and collective level? I'm thinking, you spoke of the patriarchal military complex. That seems to me like a parasitism on a collective level.
Right. Well, it just from reading the news, just from the ordinary level of macro life forms that we know about, obviously parasitism and predation are going on all the time. Human beings are technically classed as predators. You're obviously killing animals and eating them all the time. But there may be going on other levels as well, just like it's going on in the microbiological and where we have energetic organisms. I believe it's going on with them as well, and I think it does have a collective and an individual aspect, and that's why we can see individuals that seem like they're possessed and seem to have lost some degree of free will. And we also see nations. I think the dramatic example is the Nazis in World War II, where it looks like a whole nation. We have this unemployed artist who gains malevolent contact with the unconscious and has a vision of what sounds like the demiurge from Gnosticism. And the Gnostics report this same sort of parasitic arrangement between us and another species they call the archons. The movie The Matrix was largely inspired by Gnosticism. And we also see biological parasites doing very similar things, where a microbiological parasite will seem to take over a much more complex organism and get it to do its bidding. So, for example, rabies is a parasite that's microbiological. It'll take over a complex animal, a cat or a dog, and drive it into a frenzy where it wants to bite other animals, thereby opening a vector for the rabies to spread. And this is a common strategy with parasites. There are a number of parasites that do this kind of thing. They take over more advanced animals and get them to do their bidding and control their behavior.
Yeah, tapeworm comes to mind. Thank you for that very much.
And speaking of parasites, Mama Bear has a question on that specific subtopic area. Mama Bear?
Thank you, McLaren. Hi, Jonathan. Thank you again for being on the show. I do appreciate it. You often speak of mind parasites, entities that feed off of the energy of other beings. What are some of the methods that people can use to protect themselves from having their power sapped by these entities?
Well, sometimes people are disappointed because I don't have more to say about that. I have a little bit to say about it, but because I try to be careful in not thinking that I know more than I do. I think it's very reasonable, based on some of the things I've laid out, to think that such creatures exist. But when it comes to more formatory thoughts about what to do about them and what species and this kind of thing, it's much more of a gray area for me. I think some of the things, though, that seem to come up a lot and have come up in my own experience are that what many different cultures seem to say is that they sort of feed off of our negative emotions. And one way to think about this, and again, it's somewhat speculative, but I think that there's a reasonable basis for it, is that if these parasites have a certain inferiority in that if they were able to directly access chi or prana energy, life energy, as from different cultures, each seem to have a word for it, elan vital and so forth. If they had their own direct access to it, they wouldn't need to feed off of us. Though, of course, we need to feed off of plants and animals for our caloric energy. But it seems like in some way they need the energy stepped down. They don't seem to be able to feed off the energy of love or of higher consciousness. And some people see this as sort of on the blue or ultraviolet end of the color spectrum. There seems like there's a certain color analog to this. But at the redder end of baser emotions and of raw desires and kind of the cruder end of things, that does seem to be a kind of bandwidth of energy that's lower vibrational and so forth that they seem to be able to feed off of. And so one way of avoiding making yourself such wonderful food for them is to maintain your inner equilibrium psychologically. It's really the same thing you would do to avoid a human parasite. If I am off-center and fragmented, then I am more likely to be exploited by somebody who wants to, as a sex predator or a trickster with business or money. So keeping your wits about you and keeping centered is good protection for those kind of parasites as well. And then if you eat a diet that is more hypometabolic, that is not producing an excess of caloric energy, and it's been thought that eating things like meat and certain other foods, pastries and hypercaloric foods kind of have you burning at a color temperature that these parasites seem to feed off of more readily than say, a raw vegan diet. Now, again, this is speculative, but you do hear this term up a lot. And in my own personal experience, of course, that's anecdotal, I do see something like that working. And then I think just intention, because these beings live on the energetic plane, therefore thoughts and rituals of protection that you create. I mean, we could all come up with some fancy specific ritual, but I actually think the rituals that a person consciously invents themselves with great intention and originality may be the most powerful. So any sort of boundary creating ritual you want to create, one classic technique is you called theater of memory, involves picturing in great detail an estate. Should be beautifully designed. You have an infinite budget with a castle or a mansion at the center of it, and you kind of go in there and go into a private sleep chamber in there and sleep at night in that sleep chamber. And this seems to help some people have better energetic boundaries. So intentions, diet, and all the things that would just make you a more centered person with a greater inner equilibrium.
Thank you. That definitely helps clarify. Building on that, you're talking about the chamber. Can you see other technology being refined enough to insist in bringing awareness of energetic activity to the collective understanding? People being able to use the technology to be able to identify, see, refine, center?
Well, I think it's extremely possible. I mean, we not too long ago did not have the ability to pierce the microbiological world until we invented microscopes. And so I think it's quite possible that one day we will have instruments or technology that will allow us to see these things, and you'll step into something like an MRI or something, and they'll become visible. We presently don't have it, and that's a disadvantage, because then it can be thrown into this highly subjective category. And people can fall into trouble, because since it is subjective, we don't want people to fall into a mind parasite fallacy where every problem they have that might be better understood as a neurotic issue or some other kind of health problem, they may start to assume are mind parasites, because it's still in this vague and subjective place, because we don't have technologies or more objective methods for working with them.
Are you saying I can't say mind parasites made me do it?
Right, exactly.
Thank you so much for answering that follow-up question. Thanks again for being here.
Well, welcome.
And now Tipperdog would like to ask a couple of questions. Tipperdog?
Jonathan, most of the information I've found on what's called hungry ghost refers to those in the Bardo states after death. Perhaps a more comprehensive understanding could include fully alive and incarnate persons who are acting as hungry ghosts on an energetic level, with or without their knowledge or understanding. Would this be the same as parasitism and predation? And if so, would you please share your thoughts on this and perhaps give details into how this happens?
Sure. Well, many people have written about this subject, and there's one little article on my site called Energy Sappers. And basically, because those same relationships of energetic transaction play out in the normal human social sphere, we run into people all the time who are energy sappers or parasitic in one way or another. I mean, obviously, Wall Street and the, that tiny fraction of 1%. Many people are realizing, like, wow, these people are like parasites. They're feeding off of our energy in a way that is completely disproportionate to any contribution they're making to the collective. Right. But on the regular interpersonal social level, this is as simple and mundane as somebody who's holding on to your attention when you don't want them to. Like a boorish person at a party who kind of buttonholes you and keeps talking to you and is missing the obvious social clues that anybody with an ounce of sensitivity should pick up, that you want to get away or that they're holding you there against their will. Right. And so we see people, for example, a drama queen. This is somebody who creates an emotional vortex around them and tries to get other people into an emotionally excited state where they seem to feed off of their energy and attention. And we could conjecture that maybe they have parasites within them that are manipulating them to create this kind of energetic transaction. But we can also just explain it in terms of regular psychology, that this is a way that some people maintain their identity and get some kind of interpersonal energy from people. Right. So it's really happening all the time on every level of society.
Could the lower frequency centers, say of the yogic tradition, be looked at as those parasitic energies?
The lower frequencies? Yeah. Well, I don't know if I would look at the energy itself as a parasite, but I think that the parasites seem to feed off of lower energies, and that's why they're very interested in sex, for example. And just like on the microbiological plane, having sex with somebody and exchanging bodily fluids is a great way to get a parasite. Right. It seems like this holds up on the energetic plane. It's like that alchemical motto, as above, so below. Mm-hmm. And that's why, one of the reasons why, as a non-religious person who's often seen as coming from the esoteric studies and so forth, I often surprise people by being very anti-promiscuity as an unhealthy thing for most people. I think it's extremely risky. I think one of the most foolish of all oxymorons ever created was casual sex. Well, there's nothing casual about it on the microbiological plane. No. And on the energetic plane, I don't think it's casual either. You're merging your energy with somebody. It's a powerful alchemical combination. I don't see that as a merely casual transaction.
Well, it leads to divorces, but it's also divorced from awareness of what and who you are, I think, maybe.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a whole other topic, but I think that what often, one of the reasons why few enterprises besides diets, profit, and prophecy fail as often as romantic relationships, especially modern romantic relationships, is I think that one of the mistakes that a lot of people make, and also I should say this as a caveat on any discussion about Eros, and there are many writings about Eros on my website, it's one of the main things I write about, is I don't believe in any sort of one-size-fits-all, because sexuality is at the cutting edge of evolution, and the nature of human beings is to be engines of novelty. Then there's tremendous variability. So we never want to truncate the human spirit by creating a one-size-fits-all when it comes to sexuality. But as a general principle, I think that one of the things that happens is in modern romantic relationships where promiscuity is now sort of the norm and almost part of a new conventionality, is that people meet each other and they become physically intimate and sexually, in the most sexually ultimate way, really early on, and before they've really gained any other sort of intimacy with the person, like emotional intimacy or knowing who they are. Right. So I think a good rule of thumb for romantic relationships and before having physical intimacy, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. There are great marriages of 60 years that started with a one-night stand the first time they met or whatever. Every rule will have exceptions, but I think a really good rule of thumb for most people is to, if you don't know a person's shadow, if you don't know their dark side, you recognize that you don't know them, and therefore avoid physical intimacy until you really have a more complete picture of who they are.
Right. Yeah. Would you please describe how, total change of subject, but could you describe how Anantidromia can be acted in terms of current collective beliefs, and since we live in a culture with deep roots in Christianity, how that specifically can be manifested?
Well, we actually just discussed a subject that is a great segue into Anantidromia, using the example of romantic relationships and why it's important to know somebody before you commit to them or have ultimate intimacy with them. What often happens is that people have an idealization of something. They're infatuated with somebody, and therefore they idealize them. And you will see a classic Anantidromia. If you meet somebody and they're like, I just met the perfect guy, he's, Mr. Right. And then if you don't see them for 6 months, and you'd be like, well, how's John doing? Oh, that guy was such an asshole. Don't even mention his name. You have the Anantidromia. It's a term that Heraclitus, the early pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, invented. It's a tendency in nature for things to oscillate between extremes. So if you have this extreme idealization, it'll tend to turn into the equal and opposite disillusionment. It's the same way if I go on an overly restrictive diet, it'll turn into the equal and opposite binge. And one of the things that Jung noted about Christianity is it's kind of subject to a kind of Anantidromia as well, because the dark force, instead of being found everywhere, like the Taoist schematic with the yin and yang, and there's the black yin dot in the white yang, and the familiar Tai Chi symbol, and the white yang dot and the black yin. But Christians, after they expunged the Gnostics, who I think had a much healthier and more complete sense of spirituality and more empowered spirituality, they made God the summum bonum. They made him all white light, and Jesus became divine, and he had no darkness. And therefore, you create this tremendous imbalance where, like, okay, there's no darkness in them, then the darkness must be in you, the wretched sinner. And then we have, like someone like Jonathan Edwards, the famous Puritan minister, and his hellfire and brimstone sermons, where he will say things like, to God you are nothing but the most loathsome of spiders that he holds over the pit of hell, and he can barely stand to look at you, you're so awful in his eyes, and so forth. And so when you have Christ, and Jung wrote about this in his book Aeon, in an all white light Christ, then you have to have an antichrist to balance it out. You have to have a scapegoat. You have to have some group that's carrying the satanic force. And we see this playing out with the red and blue thing right now. And it relates a great deal to Anantidromia. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Chipper. Quite interesting discussion there, Jonathan. Going to shift over back into our primary area, and Uranus Rising has another question for you.
Jonathan, I know we spoke briefly about this, but I'd like to return to it, this possession by an archetype, because it's really dangerous. And I'm seeing that currently there's a lot of people out there who seem to be acting out the singularity archetype. Living out this aspect of the collective unconscious. Would you go back and describe possession of an archetype, what it looks like, and then maybe specifically identify this possession in regards to the singularity archetype with maybe some examples so we can learn how to identify when this is being played out?
Okay, great question. Well, when somebody becomes possessed by an archetype, it's like it's running them. So if I become possessed by the archetype of the eternal youth, then I may never want to be held down in a relationship. I never want to make a commitment. I am more likely to become a pilot because I want to fly free from the earth and so forth. With the singularity archetype, one type of possession by it is people who want to prematurely transcend their physical body, because this is another aspect of the singularity archetype we didn't talk about. It's a section in my book called, the section's called The Glorified Body.
Right.
And this is an
by the way.
Well, thank you. And this is one of the aspects is that there are images of luminous bodies, of transcending corporeal limitations. And of course, that actually happens for people who have near-death experiences, where there are even some verifiable evidence of their having done this and been able to remote view things that they could not have seen with their eyes and ears and so forth. So an example of possession might be anorexia nervosa. It might be somebody who is so obsessed with trying to transcend their body that they are going to become a breatharian and they starve themselves, or they try and prematurely achieve this evolutionary state while still in what I call the mortal corporeal version 1.0 body. And sometimes that can be inspiring. It could inspire somebody to become a brilliant raw foods chef or something like that. But it can also go too far, where somebody becomes a food Nazi. I think it's an unfortunate use of the term Nazi, but we know the type where their raw foodism is like a fundamentalist religion. And everything, it ceases being rational, and it's something that they have to proselytize, and it's all they think about. And they start to look very gaunt and unhealthy even because their diet is so extreme and uncompromising, and it takes over their life. So that would be an example of possession by the singularity archetype, but there are many others because there are many aspects of the singularity archetype.
Well, you know what? There's a lot of, I don't know what to call it and be diplomatic, but new age gurus about. Do you think this is a manifestation of it?
Well, some of them are a manifestation of it, definitely, because when people become possessed by an archetype, they also become extremely charismatic, and this is what people said about Applewhite, and I forget this woman companion there, Bo and Peep, they called themselves, that even their children described. I mean, they were basically middle-aged, very ordinary seeming people to most people, but when they became possessed, even their children said they were like magnets, and it was exciting to be around them, because one of the things that happens is if somebody is possessed by an archetype, and I think it's a similar thing that happens with psychopaths, they have one pointed focus. They're so completely sure of themselves. They found religion, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so for most people, what is oppressing most people, like we know that all the psychopathologies worsen when people are by themselves. That's when people cut themselves, when their eating disorder comes out, and so forth. Right. And what's oppressing many people is what psychologists call psychic entropy, where there are these fragmented, looping thoughts. And so I kind of visualize this as like an analog is if you imagine iron filings randomly scattered on a piece of paper. And now when a person of one pointed focus comes up, it's like this magnet put under the piece of paper. And now all the filings are organized in this definite pattern, which is a great relief to the person suffering from psychic entropy, to meet somebody with this overwhelming confidence and sureness. And in addition to that, they're telling you that, like, follow my way and you'll be raptured, or you'll be taken away in a UFO mothership, or whatever. There's some image of salvation that will be some kind of distorted version of the event horizon of the singularity archetype. And it will resonate within people because that archetype lives inside of us. So because it relates to an aspect of truth, even though it's highly distorted, it's extremely powerful and magnetic. Right. And I think that's one of the things going on with New Age gurus. There's another thing that I write about with New Age gurus, though, if you're interested, because it plays out so often, and that is that, and you see this especially with a lot of the Eastern gurus, a lot of the Hindu and Buddhist gurus that came over to this country, especially in the 60s, like Chogyam Trungpa, is their paths emphasized vertical transcendence over like the horizontal plane of development that you would get from Jungian psychology or many other approaches to life. And therefore, there was a complete neglect of their own personal shadow. And so
Right.
they may have reached samadhi, they may have reached states of vertical transcendence, but then you come back to your baseline personality where you might be a jerk. And now you discover you have this tremendous power over other people. And now you have a way where you can rationalize your sexual agenda and your predatory and parasitic agenda as part of a religious or spiritual trip and so forth. And this plays out constantly with not just New Age gurus, but with many religious leaders of many different sects and types and so forth.
Yes,
It's a very old story.
Yes, and I've cleaned up a lot of messes regarding that. So I thank you for your thoughts on that. It's very important for people to be aware of this. Thank you.
Well, welcome.
Jonathan, is the singularity archetype, or any archetype for that matter, static, complete as is, or is it possible to revision and co-create this archetype through our individuality and amongst our associations?
Well, absolutely. Every archetype is dynamic. It is a living thing. It is constantly changing. It has a certain coherence, though one interesting thing is that all archetypes, if you were to follow their chain of associations, would lead you to all other archetypes. They're kind of in a network together. So there's no absolute boundary between any one of them, but
Right.
they can kind of bleed into each other, and you can find elements of other archetypes mixed in, and so forth. But yes, they can change. We're changing them on the individual scale all the time. We often may forget how powerful our individual psyche and timeline is. So if I take the archetype of the eternal youth, let's say, and becoming conscious of how that works in me, I'm not going to try and buy into something like anti-aging medicine when I'm in a pro-aging body. But I realize that, like, hey, well, you know what? I do have this spirit of eternal youth. It helps me go on adventures. It helps me want to discover new things. I can adjust my relationship to the archetype, not be possessed by it, because I understand it. And therefore, that's affected the whole universe, because now the timeline of the whole universe has changed. And the history of that archetype has changed in that this particular psyche learned to relate to it in a positive way.
Right.
And then enough people doing that, then that can create a collective change. So we are influencing. It's a two-way interaction. We are influencing the archetypes are influencing us.
Right. So it's not, you want to maintain balance pretty much all the way around when you increase your abilities with the functions the archetypes represent?
Well, what you're looking for is dynamic balance, because sometimes when some people hear the word balance, they think like, oh, 50-50 with everything, the middle path and this kind of thing. But no, and I actually have my own philosophy called dynamic paradoxicalism that relates to this, is dynamic balance. And that's what the I Ching supports. There could be a time to go all the way into an archetype, like you're young and it's time to, it could be okay to be very influenced by the hero archetype. But if you stay unconsciously influenced by the heroic archetype, eventually you get your head cut off or something, or you take on one more adventure or risk than you can handle.
Yeah.
And so it's a shifting in dynamic balance, and it has to be very case specific. And we're cycling through all those archetypes. Even in the course of a day, we're going through many of them.
Kind of like a balance on a surfboard.
Exactly. The balance is constantly shifting. So maybe I'm out in a snowstorm and my car is stuck in a snowy road where nobody's around, and it's time for me to access the hero archetype and this kind of thing and so forth, just like the hexagrams of the I Ching.
Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jonathan, how do we discern the difference between the personal ego's clinging to life and stasis, including physical survival, religious and cultural conditioning, and the eschaton inherent in the singularity archetype on a collective level?
Well, if I'm understanding you right, we have the first part of what you said relates to the concerns of the ego, because the ego is very concerned with maintaining an identity, with mediating between the inner and outer worlds, with maintaining our position in the social matrix. If we have become, if part of our ego is that we're part of an organized religion and so forth, we want to maintain and defend all that kind of thing. But the nature of the event horizon is that all these givens and all these things, and I don't vilify the ego. The ego is an invaluable psychic function. It's indispensable. It's served an amazing role in evolution. I write quite a bit about it in the book. But the ego is going to view, will often view, you can have a conscious ego, and so that it doesn't view things this way. But for many egos, the event horizon and the singularity archetype and the eschaton will be viewed as the worst thing possible, because all those things that it's built up, all those structures may get taken apart. And so that's why it will often appear very dark when viewed from the point of view of the ego.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've started using the term defensive ego to delineate that from what I then term the fluid ego. Is this sort of what you're talking about? Or one is defended, it can't expand, it can't be fluid, it can't surf, as Chipperdog said. But a fluid ego can incorporate and use the archetypes. Is this what you're trying to, am I describing what you're on about, in other words?
Yeah, I mean, different people have created different terms, like maybe rigid and fluid ego would be a good dualism. But you could also, I think Jungians talk more about the conscious ego. You can have an ego that has good communication with the self. And so it's not, there's a hierarchy of psychic functions, and the ego and the mind, which some naive people in the New Age and in the East villainize. You must get rid of your ego and your mind, which is total nonsense.
I think that's what I've been responding to. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, these are you wouldn't have self-reference without an ego. We need to have a mind, and we need to have an ego to function in the world and to do many things. But the way I view it, I've written in a document on my website called A Guide to the Perplexed Interdimensional Traveler. There's a short section there on the hierarchy of psychic functions. And it's like in the I Ching, in the many hexagrams, the fifth line is the ruler, and the fourth line is the minister. And the ruler of the psyche should be the self, which Jung defined as the totality of all the psychic structures. And then the ego and the mind are like the ministers. They are like the chief science officer. They're like just, two steps behind the captain. And it's our global intuition that's in touch with ourself that should make the big decisions in our life. And then, so myself is what tells me I need to be a writer. I need to explore these mysteries. And then my ego and mind are there to like make the phone calls and do the research and to work the details. Where people get in trouble is when the ego-mind alliance becomes the captain of the ship. That's above their pay grade, and that's where they run into a lot of trouble. And then, of course, if somebody has a rigid ego, an ego that is not fluid and not in touch with other psychic functions, then that pathologizes very quickly.
Yes, and also perhaps a continual conference between the archetypes being played out in the individual and serving the self. Yeah. Thanks so much. I appreciate it very much.
You're welcome.
And rounding out our questions in this topic area, Green Meadow has one more for you.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Cliff High's WebBot project. It searches the internet for words that are outside the normal 20,000 words that most people use. And then these unusual word usages seem to signify psychic leaking. Cliff then analyzes the data to paint a possible picture of the future. Some of it has been amazingly prescient. As a result, his work has attracted a group of people who felt that some large change is pending in our future most of our lives. How do you see something like the WebBot project in relation to the Singularity archetype?
Well, I think that in broad outline, it's a very valid concept. Now, whether this actual software actually works, I'm not sure. I don't know if this is related to the Merlin Project, because I know there's a couple of versions of it. There's one called the Merlin Project. I've heard them many times on Coast to Coast, and I have frankly not been very impressed with the predictive power of it. They come up with some prophecies and predictions, and I haven't seen them play out very accurately, but I haven't done any kind of systematic analysis of it. And I know William Gibson wrote a fascinating story. I forget which one. He's the father of cyberpunk, where he talked about somebody, he wrote about somebody who would use this kind of software to figure out what was going on. And I think it's a brilliant idea in general, because I think there are these memes floating out there, and when certain memes start to light up, it certainly means something. And for example, Jung, when he was working as an analyst in the Weimar Republic, noticed that so many of his educated German patients were dreaming about Wotan, the Germanic god of war. So if we have something that can really locate obsessions in the collective that are rising and falling, that would tell us a lot about what's going on in the collective unconscious, for sure.
Yeah, it does seem to. So it's pretty fascinating. And I guess I was just thinking more of the people that it attracts. That the people are having this feeling of something pending.
Well, the feeling of something pending, that's a tricky one. Like, for example, I heard you hear George Norrie, if you listen to Coast, talk about, like, a lot of people sense that something's going to happen. And he says, I've been saying this for about a year and a half, but actually I've heard him say it for about 5 or 6 years. And of course, something is always pending. And that feeling of something pending, I think, can be a case of projection, because any human being living at any time is going to have that feeling, because we are here for a very limited time. Huge changes are impending, because at some point we're going to die, and we, in an ordinary life, there's birth, there's death, there's love, there's all kinds of stuff going on. And so with all the dramatic events that happen in a historical cycle, you can look out in the world and feel like it's always culminating. And we have more justification in feeling that today, of course, because we have so many more processes and so many more moving parts and so many more people than we've ever had before. But that was a feeling that I've seen my entire life. I'm 54 years old. I remember in the 1970s, there was a book called The Crash of '79. In the 60s, I remember my dad talking about the CIA and a shadow government, and that they were going to find a way to declare martial law, and society would crumble, and so forth. So people always seem to have these feelings, and that's why I'm a bit wary about people saying that there's a feeling of something impending.
That makes sense. Yeah, looking at your history is always a good idea.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
We are speaking with Jonathan Zapp. Please help support him by visiting his website, zapporacle.com, and consider purchasing a copy of his book, Crossing the Event Horizon, Human Metamorphosis and the Singularity Archetype. As humanity's evolution progresses, individually and socially, we will not remain stagnant, and this will mark a transition for the species. We'd like your thoughts, Jonathan, about the transition, and the first question in this area will come from Chipperdog.
Jonathan, in your Coast to Coast interview, and you talked a bit about the importance of not projecting our own shadows onto psychopaths. When we interviewed Thomas Sheridan, he talked a bit about this as well, but I think this is worth some extra exploration. So could I ask you that you first define what you mean about projecting our own shadows onto others, and discuss the process of integration of those shadow aspects within ourselves. Then, could you talk specifically about projection of our shadows on psychopaths?
Absolutely. So the shadow is a concept that Jung developed, where there's a part of our personality and our being that our conscious personality may disdain and may consider inferior and unwelcome. So, for example, if I were part of a very harshly repressive religious sect that was celibate, then maybe my whole sexuality would become part of my shadow, and it'd be something that I would be trying to fight off, and so forth. The shadow is not necessarily something that's in itself bad, but often acts out when it is not integrated into the personality. So somebody who's like that might become a rapist priest or something, because then when their sexuality that's been repressed and turned into a shadow comes out, it comes out in a way that's completely ungoverned by their ego and their superego and so forth. And so what people want to do with the darkness that they're uncomfortable with in themselves is they would much prefer to project it outside. And we hear this constantly, and it's especially often extroverted types that we hear this from the most stridently from the blue and the red sides of, they're the ones that are ruining everything. Right. It's the 1%. It's the, some guy at a bar who in his own life might be an alcoholic and a womanizer who doesn't pay his child support, is talking about Obama and about the socialists that are taking over this country and all this kind of stuff. And, the other guy at the bar is nodding his head. They can have this wonderful feeling of camaraderie and in projecting the shadow onto a common enemy and boogeyman, and now they're relieved of facing their own personal darkness that's a much bigger player in their life, because they can project it outward. And this was the idea of the scapegoat, which actually came from the Jewish tradition, where a goat would be they would project all the community's sins onto this poor animal and then chase it out of the village as some kind of symbolic expiation ritual. Right.
Yeah. Kind of solidity of perception gives rise to xenophobic response, sort of thing. No?
Exactly, and many times there's a hook for the shadow projection in the group that you or person on whom you project your shadow. It doesn't mean that they're good and you've completely misunderstood them. They could be individuals or groups that have plenty of darkness, and since we all have some of it, and that's why I say you can even project your shadow into psychopaths. I mean, the psychopaths may be as bad as they could be, but I could still be morally bankrupting myself by projecting my shadow onto them and then not facing it myself. Right. And that's a subtle danger in recognizing dark individuals and groups, is that it can relieve us of our own personal responsibilities. And again, it's a left or right thing. I remember I worked for Greenpeace, for a while in the mid 90s, and people always be talking about they and these evil corporations, and meanwhile they're cheating on their girlfriend and they're doing all kinds of unimpeccable things in their lives, but that's not talked about. They're one of the good guys. They're fighting they, and so forth.
Right, because they've got the group that supports it with them on that.
Right, they're the ones that wear the white hat.
Yeah,
and so forth.
Do you think psychopathy is a part of our evolutionary process? And if so, what role would it play in the metamorphosis? Or what role would they play in the metamorphosis?
Well, it's a very interesting question. And some evolutionary biologists think that psychopaths should be viewed as a subspecies. And there does seem to be a very fundamental difference in that can even be picked up by functional MRI scans, where if you show people images of upsetting emotional content, ordinary people, the limbic part of their brain that's associated with processing emotions will light up, right. But not for psychopaths, the parts that have to do with linguistic processing. So it's sort of like they just sort of categorize it, and they're not having the expected emotional response. And some of these evolutionary biologists that think psychopaths are a subspecies point out that this is a very successful adaptation. That if you have a species where most people are bound by conscience, but you're not, you have an enormous advantage in many areas. And also by not being subject to ordinary human emotions, you and sometimes can read people more clearly because you don't have your own emotional volatility to interfere with that. You may be an expert manipulator. Psychopaths, and they're about 1% of the male population, 0.5% for females, are known to be much better at impregnating women. Because they will abandon partners with ease. They have no conscience, so they're not worried about birth control or the consequences of an unexpected pregnancy or whatever. And so therefore, their numbers are expected to increase. Now, as far as what role they can play in the evolution, I can think of a couple of aspects. One is that one aspect that is sometimes attached to the singularity archetype is an awakening to parasitic and predatory forces that we were not aware of. Like, for example, in the movie The Matrix, when the character Neo wakes up and discovers the nature of the Matrix and discovers he's been deceived. And this is straight out of Gnosticism. So an awakening to the parasite matrix and so forth can be a key part of the singularity archetype. And I think that that's in fact happening. And one of the examples of that happening in terms of the collective unconscious, I think, is the cultural meme of the 99% versus the 1%. And many commentators have pointed out that this is statistically inaccurate, that really the people that they're talking about are a tiny fraction of 1%.
Right.
But it just so happens that psychopaths are 1%. And so maybe this is really, and psychopaths are disproportionately in Wall Street and in high finance and in politics. And they push themselves into leadership positions, and they go where the action and the energy and the money, which is
turnover.
Exactly. And they have every quality that a human resources director at a large corporation is looking for: charisma, decisiveness, emotional detachment, and so forth. They're more intelligent than average. And so they've got a great adaptation going. Now, when we pull back the evolutionary context and zoom out on our individual timelines and so forth, then we start to see that predators and parasites look like symbionts, right? I mean, if we have gazelles and no tigers and other predators, then the gazelles would get slower.
Right. And
the predators improve the evolution of the prey in some cases. In fact, much of evolution it may be a response to predation and parasitism. And so, for example, some British biologists, I think at Oxford, who came up with something they called the Red Queen hypothesis. The Red Queen is a reference to Alice in Wonderland, where the Red Queen tells Alice, here you see you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in one place. And so the Red Queen hypothesis says that because parasites outnumber other species 3 or 4 to 1, and because they evolved so quickly and are so well adapted, that the only way that host organisms could keep up was through sexual reproduction, as compared to the earlier asexual reproduction. That sexual reproduction allows for more genetic novelty, and that therefore sexual reproduction was a response to parasitism.
Wow.
And so therefore you can see that this is a prod to evolution. And so it's sort of, there's a similar way in which it seems like evil or darkness is needed for development. So, for example, a very simple thought experiment: if you're going to play God, which you would if you were, say, writing a novel. If you're writing a novel where you want to have a character who's going to develop spiritually, let's say a young man. Now, if you give him the perfect girlfriend where they have a completely harmonious relationship and both parents like each other, there's no Montagues or Capulets. They live in a country where the politicians are honest and the economy is great and so forth. This is going to be the world's most boring novel, and there's not going to be much development of character because there's no challenge and there's no adversity. And so if you take the ring wraiths and the orcs and Saruman and Sauron out of Lord of the Rings, you have hobbits going out on dates with other hobbits. You don't have a change of epics, and life, of time cycles like you have in Lord of the Rings, without the adversity and the adversaries. So they may be a spur to evolution in this paradoxical way that we need adversaries.
A little bit of tension goes a long way.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jonathan, in your book, you wrote about how Logos Beheld examines imagery as an alternative communications modality compared to the written or spoken word. Can you elaborate on this concept and how it applies within the transition?
Sure. So I got this phrase from Terence McKenna, who got it from Philo Judaeus, who is a Jewish philosopher contemporary of Christ. He was from that Hellenic, where Hellenic philosophy and Jewish philosophy were kind of, and Gnosticism were all kind of coming together, and there was a great cross-fertilization. And what Philo said was that we would sort of have reached the omega point. Obviously, didn't use these words necessarily, but reached at the higher level of evolution, crossed the event horizon when the Logos, the voice of God, was beheld instead of heard. And so we see a change going on right now where visual communication is exploding. I mean, when I look at I grew up with a more text-based world of, black and white television, but a lot of books and newspapers. And now I'm looking at my computer screen and there are all these icons and images, and we are becoming ever more visual. And we can easily lose sight because we're so immersed in it of what a gigantic change this is. I mean, in the first days of silent films, when they had the first lens that was a zoom lens, because before they just had fixed focal length lenses, and they zoomed in on a woman's face, and people in the audience gasped because why is this woman's face getting bigger? They couldn't, the surreal world of movies and television that we completely understand because we've been born into it is not something that's easily comprehended by a cat or a dog or somebody who didn't grow up in a completely image-saturated culture. And a few weeks ago, I was watching a movie, the opening of a movie with a 7-year-old, and just in the opening credits, there were, the rapid edits and surreal montages, and a whole story within a story was being told, and the 7-year-old completely comprehended it. And that's Logos Beheld. There was very little dialogue during that montage. It was all communicated with images, and that's the way movies are supposed to be designed. So, when people in the movies will say, show it, don't tell it, and this kind of thing. So it's perfectly possible as an alternate means of communication to go visual. And this is one of the things that Terence pointed out about cephalopods like the octopi, is that they kind of wear their language on their skin. They have chromatophores, almost like pixels that they're covered with, where they can rapidly change their color, the texture of their skin and so forth, and communicate all kinds of things about their inner state to other octopi who have relatively good vision. And this is something that's embedded in the material about the Singularity archetype. Many of the different versions of it will involve very unusual eyes, and eyes that light up, for example, and often explicitly there will be a visual telepathy. Conventionally we think of telepathy as I hear what you're thinking. But this really, besides being an invasion of privacy, isn't really much better than speaking or calling somebody on the phone. But if instead of hearing what you are thinking, we can visually see what you are thinking. This actually occurs on the organic plane already. I mean, on the technological plane, this would be the idea of a futuristic extrapolation of virtual reality, where it would be responsive to your psychic intentions, and it would create this, we could enter some virtual world together like characters on Star Trek do with a holodeck, and it would reflect things inwardly. So if I were angry with you, then maybe I'd take you onto a holodeck program that, has a boxing ring and so forth. And but we have cases of mutual dreaming They're not extremely common, but there are some very well verified ones. I've had a couple of personal experiences, and because I do dream interpretation, that's one of the services people can find out about on my site. I've heard numerous cases of people having mutual dreaming. It's more likely to happen when people are very close, like lovers, and especially more likely to happen if they're sleeping in the same bed or at least the same house, and where they share a dream. Now, if you think about that, that's logos beheld communication of the highest order already, because somehow we are both generating a whole environment and a whole visual realm through psyche to psyche direct communication. And that's an extremely rich, think of all the layers of symbolism, we know that dreams can use, all the information that could be communicated, and as compared to these few mouth noises that we're making, as Terence referred to them, this like pressure modulation signal where we have to look up, rapidly in our heads a dictionary of words and hope that your definition of words is the same as mine and that we haven't misheard words and so forth. This would be a much more potent form of communication. And so that seems to be where evolution is heading.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot more sense and certainly fleshes out the material in your book quite well. Thank you very much. Disaster Cat also has another question about your book.
Yes. Can you please talk about the concept of UFOs as, quote, reality transformers, unquote, and would you be willing to give us your own personal views on what the UFO phenomenon is? And also, could you go into a bit more detail about the similarities between UFO abductions, near-death experiences, and the relationship to the end of the world apocalyptic motifs? I really thought that was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. And these are all sections in my book. So if you want the more thorough version, that would be the place to look for it. I'll give some thumbnail sketches to some of those questions because we'd be here all night if I were to give you the really thorough treatment. But reality transformers, this was something in one of the Jacques Vallée books. And if anybody that wants to study UFOs with any kind of rigorous approach and without falling into some of the true believer kind of approaches, absolutely must read Jacques Vallée. He's the most indispensable person to ever write about the subject as far as I'm concerned, and a lot of people have that idea, and he references Jung quite often. And this was something that a scientist, I believe, told Vallée at one point. He said, if you wanted a single definition of valid definition of what the UFO or visitor phenomenon is, you should think of them as reality transformers. That this is much more likely to be what they are than say, rigid nuts and bolts spacecraft made out of metal and this kind of thing. And so, because and this corresponds to many things in the literature where they will be described as changing shape and merging with one another, and they seem to follow more the physics of dreams, where in dreams things are idioplastic. They are changed, their physical form, in response to psychic intentionality, cultural expectations, and so forth. And so maybe in the same chapter, Vallée talks about, to think of it as, if you're sitting in a movie theater in the front row and you're watching this movie and you're completely wrapped up in the story that's unfolding in front of you. But if you really want to know what's going on, you have to kind of like look back over your shoulder and look back at the projector that's projecting the whole phantasmagoria of images and storylines. And so there have been many studies, and Vallée has done some of them, that show that the UFO phenomenon is something that really is cross-cultural. In other cultures, they may be referred to by other names and words, and the mythology surrounding them may alter. If you're Celtic, maybe you talk about fairies abducting somebody or elves. But if you're living in a technological culture, then maybe you perceive them as aliens in spacecraft with imperialistic agenda and so forth that's more culturally appropriate. And so it seems that this is a shape-shifting phenomenon, and therefore it seems like it's a logos beheld phenomenon, because they're able to sometimes appear differently to different observers at the same time. And they may have the ability to appear in a variety of guises and so forth. And so this is a strong connection between them and some of the evolutionary motifs. A lot of the stories and dreams that reflect the singularity archetype will involve UFOs, including the ones that first inspired me when I was a child to realize that there was some mystery that I had to investigate. And also there's a connection between near-death experience and death and the UFO phenomenon, where it's quite common that people will have a, say, near-death experience and that they'll see their mother who's deceased appear, but she'll look like a gray alien. And so there's a strong overlap. When Terence McKenna took pictures of gray aliens and showed them to Amazonian shamans, they said, oh, the ancestors. So this is when we break out of the box that people who have not really researched the subject fall into often, where it's just assumed, well, they must be extraterrestrials. They assume that that's the only really reasonable hypothesis, but that hypothesis has been criticized by Vallée, for example, who points out, wow, if they're doing genetic manipulation or a complete genetic sample, that they're awfully inefficient because there have been so many visitations over so many years. Why are they still at it? And if they're so advanced, we have stealth technology already. Like, why do they fly across the sky lit up like Christmas ornaments if they're trying to avoid detection? In the so-called postmodern approach to ufology, Terence McKenna has talked about this a little bit. You instead of trying to decide what they are, which seems to be perhaps unanswerable at this level of understanding, we look at what effect they're having on culture, and they are manipulators of cultural memes, and that may be really what they're up to. When you can usually tell when somebody is an unreliable spokesperson for ufology or ufologist based on how much they claim to know. So the person who can tell you the names of everybody on the Palladian High Council is probably somebody possessed by an archetype. But the most intelligent observers like Vallée will point out the extreme limits to what we can know presently about who they are and what they're really up to. And I might have missed part of your question. If I did, feel free to remind me.
Well, the only thing that I wanted to add, actually on the question, was on its relationship to the apocalyptic motifs. But first I wanted to mention that my husband has a PhD in Old Norse studies, and I'm really fascinated by your answer because he has pointed out to me that a lot of the UFO abduction stories sound very, very close to both the Celtic and the Norse traditions of being taken away by the Alfar or the fairies to the other world, and even things like sexuality and, coming back 100 years later and things like that. They were very, very common. So I'm just really fascinated by this. If you have anything more on the end of the world connections, that would be great too. Otherwise, I just want to thank you for your answer.
Well, sure. The end of the world is often associated with UFOs. So, for example, evangelical Christians will commonly believe that Hal Lindsey, for example, that wrote The Late Great Planet Earth and so forth, may have been one of the first to get this started, where they're seen as deceiving devices of Satan and the Antichrist and so forth, and that will be used in some end-game scenario. And in many of the classic science fiction stories that are great manifestations of the singularity archetype, the ones that influenced me as a child especially, and Childhood's End and by Arthur C. Clarke, and the Village of the Damned, a British science fiction movie, also the novel it was based on, The Wyndham Cuckoos. It's the arrival of UFOs that signal the approach of the event horizon and a complete evolutionary shift. And so they are, very much associated with eschaton and all kinds of things, and new variations of this mythology play out. And when I say that this is a mythology, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that they're nothing but myths, and people may also misunderstand what myths are. It doesn't mean that they are unreal. Jung noted, for example, he wrote a book called Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things in the Sky. He noted that they reflected radar. In certain ways, myths are the most real things in our environment. They are the things that govern what happens at the essence. So something being a myth doesn't make it unreal or purely a flighty fantasy type thing. And something can be both a real 3D thing and be mythological, just like a hero can be that, or a person who's playing out an archetype of evil or the eternal youth. It doesn't make them unreal.
Well, thank you very much. That was a really great explanation. I really appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.
And the next question will be back to Uranus rising.
Jonathan, it has been written, especially by Stan Groff, that people experience times of transition in the same manner that they experience their birth, such as an easy birth equals an easy transition, a difficult birth equals a difficult transition. And I've actually observed this process in working with people. It's important, I think, to add that death is a transition. So if we are going to be going through a process of transition and metamorphosis, I'm wondering if people will play out their own individual experiences of birth, or do you foresee a shared collective experience of that process?
Well, I mean, I think it could be either or, both and. I did actually talk to Stan Groff a little bit about the way I saw initiation, the way he saw it about 3 years ago.
Wow.
And the connection that he makes with birth trauma and so forth, I think is a very important one. I think, like many people that have a theory, it tends to be something that they may see maybe a little bit too much through it. But I mean, that's forgivable, I guess, because, we all do that. I'm sure I'd do some of that with the Singularity archetype. And I think that whether you want to see it as people having different views based on how smoothly their birth went, or how much they are identified with a rigid ego, or I'm not sure which is more valid. I would probably go with the ego model. But any of these things could influence how somebody perceives the singularity and the event horizon, and also how it manifests in their lives. Yeah. Because there could be outer world macro events that bring it forward that would have different levels of shock. So for example, in an individual time scale, well, we all are heading toward that event horizon, guaranteed, because if there isn't a collective eschaton first, we have personal death to look forward to. And we see many different styles of dying and many ways in which people relate to death very differently. For the ego, it's an emergency. For the self, it may be seen as an emergence. And on the collective scale, many different things could happen. I mean, I think that I can't bring philosophical precision to this. That would be a lifetime's endeavor. But I believe in a degree of free will, and therefore I think it's possible that there are aspects of the future that are formed and other aspects that are unformed, and that gives some room for free will. And so it's formed, for example, that we will all die of something or another, but there may be some unformed aspects, less if I'm a citizen of Pompeii in 600 or whatever, where we're all going to be wiped out by a volcano at the same time. More if it turns out that my health choices and my diet was the major player in determining the timing of my death, rather than some macro geological event, for example. And so so the future and the way that the singularity archetype presents to us collectively, and also in some individual timelines, may greatly color how we experience it and how we react to it.
Right.
I don't know if I answered all parts of your question.
Oh, yes,
so
yes.
Okay.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much.
Quite
Appreciate
welcome.
it.
And now we turn to Green Meadow, and she has a couple of questions for you, Jonathan.
Okay.
Hi, Jonathan. So returning a little bit to people are feeling this pending future change feeling. Is it prescient, or is it desire of mutants to have a world that's where they're not a round peg in a square hole? And if so, what do you see as the purpose of this?
Well, I think it's all those things and a few things more. And it's, first of all, on the more legitimate or literal side, obviously there's future shock. We are living in a world of incredibly accelerated change. And so that should have us all a little bit on edge. The metabolism of the species is heating up. According to some estimates, there are more human beings alive today than all the human beings that have ever lived or ever died, I should say. And so it's reasonable to see a culminating process. Of course, I think that a feeling of something impending would be even more reasonable to somebody living in, say, 1939. But other things can cause that feeling of impendingness. So, for example, if you are a round peg living in the patriarchal world, then you want to feel that enormous change is impending, that the Messiah is going to come, that the mutant revolution, that whatever you see it, that if you're a transhumanist, the technological singularity, that this game change thing is going to happen. If you're a communist or a socialist, it'll be the overthrow of capitalism. But a lot of people are unhappy. That's kind of the nature of human incarnation, and are therefore looking for a reset button, a game change, and this kind of thing. And they've always been looking for that. I think of the novel by The Last Temptation of Christ. It's by a Greek novelist whose name I can't pronounce. Anyway, okay, thank you. And I remember that an early scene in that novel, there's an adolescent Jesus who's sort of prescient and empathic and sort of psychic, and he is walking above in the hills just above his town, I guess Bethlehem, and he is feeling in all the Jews that are sleeping in that town a common thought form, because they were all suffering so much under Roman oppression, and what he feels inside of each heart is how long, Adonai, how long? Because they were so unhappy, and when would the Jewish Messiah come and bring in 1,000 years of peace that are predicted in the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible? And so they felt this sense of impending change then, and obviously the author of the book of Revelation described changes that he thought was going to happen in the 1st century AD, not in the year 1999 or whenever. And so one of the reasons why the feeling of impendingness, we touched on this a little bit earlier, is always something that people feel, is because in human beings, there's always this confusion of inner and outer. We project highly charged inner contents outside of ourselves. So, for example, romantic projection. Let's say a man is walking down the street, he sees a beautiful woman, and he feels like, I've known her from other lifetimes. We were meant to be together. Well, from the point of view of Jungian psychology now, in some rare case, maybe they really are destined soulmates. But in most cases, what's going on is, and even in those rare cases, is anima projection. The anima would be like the contrasexual, the feminine part of himself that's more repressed from his consciousness, and therefore he a heterosexual man would classically project that onto a beautiful woman, and really maybe it's just based on the look of her eyes and her hair and her figure and this kind of thing, and has nothing to do with who she actually is and what she wants or anything. But in a certain sense, his perception is correct. What he feels, we were meant to be together, we've known each other from other lifetimes, because he's talking about his own soul. But the confusion that could turn him into a stalker or make him an obnoxious person to this actual woman is that he's confused inner and outer, and he's literalized this inner perception and projected it outward. So one of the other highly charged psychic contents that we all have is our recognition that we're hurtling toward death. And for many people, that's a very anxious and unpleasant feeling, and they have this feeling that, like, this is all so tenuous, this could change at any moment, something shattering is impending, I can feel it, the world is going to end. You see, so they can project that fear of personal death, which is guaranteed and really is impending outside, then you have this like the eschaton, the imagined end of the world scenario is like a lightning rod. And then it also is very relieving to the ego, because the ego, one of the threatening things about death is that you face it alone. And you also lose your place in the social hierarchy that the ego has worked all its life to build an identity and a place in the social hierarchy. But you know, if I die of some disease alone, now all these other people I know keep living, and they can talk about me behind my back and say wrong things, and I won't be there to manipulate anybody or control anything, and it feels unfair. But if we're all checking out together, then that feeling of being picked on by death is leveled out. And then if I can add things like a rapture, where the kind of people I like, who are part of my subculture, get saved, and kind of people I don't like, secular humanists and so forth, are left to deal with the Antichrist, well, now you have an all-satisfying scenario that takes that inner fear of death, that feeling of something impending, and creates a fantastically satisfying scenario with it.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like it's a normal thing, and we're also living in times that help trigger it.
Yeah, and at some points, the sense of something impending at sometimes will be more accurate than others, even if it's motivated by the same thing. Because if you're living right before the outbreak of the Civil War or of World War II or of some other cataclysmic event, then your sense of something impending will seem more valid. It may have been motivated by the same thing, or it may have been a psychic sense that really accurately predicted some macro shock. But we shouldn't make too much of people's anecdotal reports that they sense something impending, because people have always sensed that.
Yeah, okay. So then my next question is, I've observed people trying to spend a great deal of energy trying to know what will happen, trying to prepare, trying to be safe. But then I see people fixate on a particular doom idea of the future, and this allows them to be a knowing versus not knowing, which can be comforting to them, but also has the potential for being off track or inflexible in the face of actual changes. So I wonder if fixing on a particular doom scenario is participating in manifesting that future, and how do you balance coming to conclusions versus being a not knowing in the face of the singularity archetype?
Well, this is the ego trying to reassert itself as the top dog in the hierarchy of psychic functions, because this sense of an unformed eschaton out there is outside of ego control. The future is the unknown, but the ego would like to bring that under control, and so and sometimes it will succeed. Maybe I will create a retirement plan that will actually work. But quite often, unforeseen things happen. I might have an IRA, but it proves to be worthless because there's runaway inflation. But the ego wants to kind of tie all these things down. If the ego knows a date and it knows what's going to happen, then I can have my emergency food rations and my bomb shelter and all that kind of stuff. And we get the survivalist type that want to kind of control the future. And if I know a date and that kind of thing, then that makes me feel more in control, and it also binds me to linear time. And one of the aspects of the event horizon is an irrealizing of linear time. So once you attach to a particular end date, now you're caught in linear time, and the very thing that will make you rigid and unable to deal with a rupture of plane event where linear time is no longer runs in the same way, just like it doesn't in a near-death experience, and it doesn't at night when we dream. And that's why some people who live very powerfully in their ego will tend to have a lot of insomnia and can't deal with entering the dream time where they lose their control. And so, and of course, what can happen, as your question implied, is that when people start projecting all of these expectations toward an end time event, well, the world doesn't usually end, but unpleasant things can happen. The suicide of all those people in Heaven's Gate, or people can try and create end world, scenarios. I mean, this was one of the fears that like Middle Eastern scholar Bernard Lewis had, and some others had, about Ahmadinejad in Iran. I mean, it's proved to be a much more complex situation, and other analysts, like the former head of Mossad, says that they're actually more rational actors than you might think. But anyway, there was a great deal of worry, and there still is among some people, because he's very influenced by an apocalyptic prophecy about the Mahdi that will come back, and it was feared that he was motivated to create an end of the world scenario, which he could do with even a single nuclear weapon, and set off a whole huge nuclear war or something, in order to bring in that apocalyptic scenario. Or, for example, in the Reagan administration, and I've heard this actually from Jehovah's Witnesses that I've met even recently, we don't need to take care of the environment, because the second coming is on its way, and then none of that will matter. And so then that creates real ecological damage right now, because we have people like, James Watt, I think he was the Secretary of the Interior under Reagan, said we don't have to worry about the trees, because the second coming is going to make all that irrelevant, and had policies to, destructive policies to match that point of view.
Wow. Well, that's a good answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And now you're going to get another chance with Mama Bear, and I'm sure she has something very interesting to ask you.
Okay.
Thank you, McLaren. Jonathan, this has been such a fascinating interview. Thank you again. Following up on that, talking about developing our ideals and so forth, you've spoken against New Age fundamentalism, specifically concerning the idea that we create our own reality. You also seem to acknowledge quantum mechanics and the profound implications of the particle-wave duality. In your view, is there any way for us to use these principles of quantum mechanics on a physical level at this time?
Well, it's a tricky issue, because obviously quantum mechanics has vast implications. It's something that's been demonstrated, so to 12 decimal places, that it really has some, in some way, captures and understands very key aspects of our whole reality. On the other hand, it speaks in a language of mathematics, and it talks about the subatomic domain. And we have to be very careful, because there are a lot of people in the New Age that use quantum mechanics and non-locality as sort of an endless supply of fairy dust to justify almost any proposition. And so, since I'm not a physicist, I want to be very cautious in not reading too much into quantum mechanics. But it's some of the things that it suggests, like entanglement, there seems to be evidence of on the human plane. So, for example, parapsychologists, people like laser physicist Russell Targ, who was part of the U.S. government's remote viewing program. I know he wrote a book called Limitless Mind, for example, where he talks about this, that it looks like the human psyche is non-local. And for example, if you put somebody in a Faraday cage, like early Soviet parapsychologists would call it mental radio. People tend to see the psyche in terms of the technology available at the time, and that's why Jung talked a lot about steam and repression and bottled up libido, because he grew up in a steam technology world. And we often analogize, or actually, unfortunately, literally think of the brain as, or the human mind as a computer, which is unfortunate and misleading. And so to test this, they would put people in Faraday cages that block all electromagnetic radiation, and it did not diminish parapsychological effects. So and also those effects don't seem to diminish through physical distance in a lot of experiments, which an energetic signal would tend to decline over distance. And so it looks to Russell Targ and to some other parapsychologists like the mind is non-local. And of course, this is a concept that quantum mechanics seems to demonstrate, where you can have particles across the universe from each other, but they're still connected. And so non-locality, I think, is something that is also there's evidence from that, from Rupert Sheldrake's work with morphogenetic fields. I guess now he just calls them morphic fields. Suggests a non-locality or a field aspect to consciousness and also to information in general. And I think that this has huge implications and it is a huge validation of Jung's idea of the objective unconscious, or, at first it was called the collective unconscious. And some people think objective unconscious is a better term. So that's an aspect of quantum mechanics that I think we could bring into the human domain without creating too many fallacies.
Thank you so much.
And the last question in this topic area will be from Green Meadow. Green Meadow?
Hi, Jonathan. Is there a difference between a paradigm shift, an end of an era, and the singularity archetype? For example, the change from agricultural monarchy system to the industrial democratic system was a major paradigm shift. Was it also a singularity archetype?
Well, not necessarily. You could, in some analogy or talk about it as a rupture of plane event, but it would not really have all the aspects of the singularity archetype. It's clearly a paradigm shift. It's clearly a great change. And since the singularity archetype is about great changes, there's a certain little bit of resonance there, but it wouldn't really have all the aspects of the singularity archetype, because we still, the ego is retained or even strengthened as we move into the industrial age, and many of the things that are seen as changing with the singularity archetype are actually strengthened by that particular paradigm shift.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The next topic area encompassing the next set of questions is metamorphosis. Jonathan, earlier you gave us some brief overview in relation to the glorified body. Could you perhaps give us a little bit more of an indication of how the glorified body interacts with the metamorphosis, and then how you see the movie Avatar and some other science fiction stories as allegories of this?
Okay. Well, the glorified body, and obviously that's a Christian term, but I'm not coming from a Christian perspective, but it's something that turns up in every culture, basically, is a body that transcends mortal limitations. So this could be Jesus coming back from the dead, and he's more etherealized, and he's in a radiant body. This could be, from the materialist culture, it could be Superman, a man of steel who can outrun locomotives, and very helpful in our culture is bulletproof and so forth. That would be a more materialist version of the glorified body. We see it in all kinds of lore and all kinds of mythology. The vampire mythology is essentially about that, especially the Anne Rice vampire mythology, where vampires, as they age, become more glorified. They become less dependent on blood. They become more etherealized and more powerful. And it is something that causes great suffering, because we have a frustrated will toward that glorified body. We have a desire, everywhere you look in human culture at this point, in the human enterprise right now, we see a tremendous will to break every kind of code that there is. We've broken the atom down with our super colliders into ever more improbable subatomic particles. We've broken the genetic code. We are everywhere we look, we are learning how to get at that source code of the matrix, so to speak. But a place that where we have the greatest trouble with that, if I'm playing World of Warcraft and I'm in a virtual environment, I can have an avatar, and that comes from Hindu mythology. It means a spirit being descended into the flesh. So it's interesting that the computer industry would adopt that term. I can increase the muscle definition on my avatar with mouse clicks, but much harder for me to do that in my own aging corporeal version 1.0 mortal corporeal body. But we would like to do that. This is why people will undergo the surgeon's knife in an attempt to have a few less wrinkles. This is why people will endure punishing workouts. that are not merely for health, but because they want to have a different physique than they have, and so forth. And basically, wherever you have a core intention like that in a species, it's always fulfilled. It may not be fulfilled by every individual. Only in human beings could we even imagine a core intention that is not fulfilled. But it is fulfilled. For example, when I dream, which is something built into the cycle of every day, now I am in a dream body. And in my dream body, I'm not bound by gravity. I can fly. I might be a different age, a different body type. We also have energetic bodies that are recognized by almost every culture. We talk about the etheric body, the light body, the astral body, the fine energy body. All these different traditions will talk about these glorified bodies that we already have. But especially in a materialist culture, we become very closely and unhappily identified with our aging physical body. And some who are materialists will look for a technological rapture, like a Ray Kurzweil, and will hope that they will, by taking 150 supplements a day like Ray does, that they'll live long enough for quantum supercomputers that they'll be able to download their consciousness into, and this kind of thing, and escape their mortal body through a technological singularity. So we see this drive for the glorified body really heating up. It's always been there, but it seems to be even more active. And it's also, in a certain way, a completely appropriate desire. So, once culture evolved where we could have complex textiles, we would have more outfits of clothing and not just wear one deerskin outfit all day for every occasion. And so it's only appropriate for me to dress one way to go to a athletic event, and to dress another way for a romantic evening, and another way for a business meeting, and so forth. But if I were to tell you, you can only have one set of clothing for your whole life, you'll wear it till it wears out, and when it's completely worn out, you'll be dead. That would be a very unsatisfactory state of affairs. So it's very natural for us to want to be shapeshifters and to want to have the bodies that we feel accord with our inner psychic state. And that's what happens in the dream time, and that's what happens in virtual reality environments like networked video games or Second Life and so forth. And so an avatar is it's more than an allegory. Allegory is an inferior type of fantasy usually. Tolkien was very critical of allegory. He was probably mad at his friend C.S. Lewis, who wrote poor quality fantasy from Tolkien's point of view that was allegorical. In Avatar, we see this happening right from the opening scene. In the opening scene, that a lot of people forget, is actually the character Jake, who's a very ordinary seeming Marine, and he's flying in his dream body. That's what's happening in the opening scene. He's in the waking life, he's a paraplegic, but he escapes in the dream time into a dream body that can not only function, it can fly. And then one of the most numinous moments in the movie for a lot of people is when this paraplegic Marine, and notice that there could be few scenarios where you'd have more will toward wanting to rebel from your mortal body than if you're this athletic, physical young male with all this will to live and will to do physical things, but now you're stuck in a wheelchair. So there's a tremendous desire to escape that limitation, and there's a very powerful moment when he sees his avatar that he's going to merge with. And so and with the technology of 3D and so forth, we get this experience with him of what it would be like to escape our physical bodies into more powerful bodies, because the bodies of the Na'vi that are just what for them is their normal organic form, in the reduced gravity of Pandora, and with all the powers and visual acuity and so forth of their bodies, these are really like glorified bodies. And he goes through a death-like experience. He enters what looks sort of like a sarcophagus, like sort of put into an MRI-like device or something, and through a death-like process where he goes to sleep to his waking life, or a dream time-like process. He then wakes up in this avatar, and that was a very delightful thing, and that obsessed people so much that there was something called the Na'vi blue phenomenon, where there'd be like kids in Japan who would be suicidally depressed and even contemplate killing themselves. One of them talked about this in a CNN report, wanting to kill himself, hoping he would wake up on Pandora in the body of a Navi. And so this is a great desire we have. We see it in, it may be an underlying motivation in body image disorders and in eating disorders. And it plays out in the singularity archetype, where there are all these visions of a transcendence of the human body. And in fact, this also happens in an experiential way and in a way that's should be very empirically convincing to people with near-death experiences, like in the Pam Reynolds case that I document in detail in the book, where this woman was under state-of-the-art medical monitoring and she had zero electrical activity in her brain. In fact, she had no blood in her brain during a rare procedure called standstill. And yet she had enhanced senses, even though her eyes were taped shut and her ears were completely non-functioning. There was no electrical activity in her brainstem, and they had 128 decibel clicking sounds and earbuds in her ears to see if they could get any reaction off their brainstem. They couldn't. And so even if her brain was working, it would be hard to hear things with 128 decibel clicking sounds in your ears. And yet she was able to report all kinds of unusual things that people said and so forth. And when you really study the near-death experience material, it shows you that the position of neurological materialism, which reigns in academia and science today, where it's assumed that consciousness, if it's admitted that consciousness exists at all, is an epiphenomenon or secondary effect of biochemical process in the brain. Well, this position is completely defeated by these findings from near-death experience research. You don't need a functioning brain to have a consciousness, and what people consistently report is that they're incredibly enhanced when they're separate from their body. I've had numerous personal out-of-body experiences. It's purely anecdotal. It shouldn't convince anybody, but it definitely convinced me and caused my fear of death to vanish. And you feel incredibly enhanced, and people will report spherical vision, where they more than 360-degree vision, where they can see what's under the surgeon's feet and what's on top of the hospital, and sometimes even provide accurate reports of a pair of sneakers outside the ledge, outside the window, and they'll find them there and so forth. And so we have an ability to transcend our physical bodies and to enter a glorified body. That's what we will do if we're able to travel further when we cross the event horizon of death. And it is the images of the glorified body are infused in the singularity archetype and haunt the collective imagination in all kinds of ways.
Wow. That was a lot more than I was expecting, but thank you so much. Shifting back from the physical into the psychological, in regard to the metamorphosis, would you give us a brief synopsis of the future of the ego from an evolutionary perspective and how this relates to the singularity archetype?
Sure, and I go into this in great length in the book. There's a whole section devoted to this. And first we need to understand, because so many people naively vilify the ego, the ego served a fantastic evolutionary purpose, because I think a kind of group telepathy is really more the norm in nature. If you look at a school of fish, there's no acoustic signal that's necessary, like talking, to keep them all swimming in perfect unison, or a flock of birds. It really looks like there's, I'm not saying that I know that absolutely, because maybe there's some pheromone, maybe there's something that some other causal signal that keeps them all together, but it really looks like there is evidence of telepathic networks in nature, just like we see that imagined in the world of Pandora. And but it actually, that was something that put a limit on evolution in a certain way, that it was better to create a firewall between us and that group telepathic network, because that allowed something of incredible value, the greatest engine of novelty we've ever seen, individuality, to emerge. So by the creation of the ego and a psychic structure that would tend to encapsulate us and strengthen the I and diminish the we, you get more individuality. Like we have more individuality in the West than we did, say, in China during the Cultural Revolution, where people were so brought up in a culture that was so we-oriented, and classes would all get a common grade, that they would even become confused by all the use of the pronoun, the first-person pronoun, I, was confusing to them because it was so culturally abnormal. Now, of course, with any increase in evolutionary novelty, as we mentioned before, the outer edge of light and the outer edge of dark both intensify. So with more individuality, we get more weird pathologies, and we get more dark things happening too. Not all the individuality is pleasing to us and so forth, but it is highly novel and highly variable. And so that was a huge part of the purpose of the ego, I believe, on an evolutionary basis. But now that whole stream of evolution has reached a self-limiting cul-de-sac, maybe even a sort of Damocles hanging over our head, because the perspective of the ego, as it pathologizes in many people, is looking out for number one and looking out at a world, and instead of seeing a living matrix of which we're all a part, that there's like this thin film of life on the planet. A lot of astronauts are suddenly shocked by that perception when they see the Earth as a single object from space. Instead, I look out at this, like Napoleon looking out at the world as a chessboard, and that you're either a king or a pawn, and looking out for number one, and everything else is real estate and livestock there for me to conquer and manipulate. Well, that's the perspective of the ego run amok, which happens quite often. And with our present lethal technologies that we never had before, and with psychopathic egos sitting behind the buttons and the control panels of those lethal technologies, and that has to change if we're going to survive. And that's one of the aspects of the writing being on the wall, that the ego as presently conceived is going to have to metamorphose. And what it looks like from the evidence from the Singularity archetype is that there's going to be a return to a telepathic network. But it will be one that in many of the versions conserves the novelty of individuality. And so, for example, one of the versions of the Singularity archetype is the classic the masterpiece of science fiction, the Dune novels by Frank Herbert, that have been continued by his son and Kevin J. Anderson. And there's a superconscious sisterhood that also acts to manipulate and improve human evolution. And they have a rite of initiation called the Water of Life, where a powerful psychotropic poison is taken by an initiate. And if they survive, many don't, but if they survive it, they will become aware of all the Reverend Mothers, those are the ones who have passed this rite, that have ever lived before, and have access to all their memories and psyches, while retaining their own individuality. So this is what I call an example of Homo Gestalt, where you have a networked human organism that's with a telepathic bond between multiple individuals, but where individuality is retained.
Okay, wow. I hope that hasn't taken away too much from your book, and some of our listeners will still be inspired to go read. Mama Bear, I think you have a question for Jonathan.
Thank you, McLaren. And actually, Jonathan, thank you. Everything that you're saying just makes me want to read your book that much more. So thank you for this information. And I look forward to exploring that and more in depth. Leading into that, you're talking about the ego, but also with the those who have a deep commitment to consciousness. You're calling them mutants. What is the role of mutants in our society? Is the world catching up to the mutant mindset? If so, what does this mean for the questing individual? And again, obviously, this leads to ego as well.
Well, the mutants are always more powerful than they seem to be. And this is also part of the mythology of the Singularity archetype. And like, for example, there's an anime classic, that's a work of total genius called Akira, that was made in the 80s. And the eponymous mutant of Akira, is so powerful that his few remaining cells have to be kept like it's also kind of mythologically interesting that they have to be deep underground, have to be kept like 30 sub-basements below ground and absolute zero, because if even a single cell reanimates, it will threaten the whole power system of the whole patriarchal military-industrial complex of Neo-Tokyo. And this is kind of an example of a theme we see played out. You can see it in the X-Men or in Star Wars, where just a couple of Jedi, because of their advanced consciousness, could be a threat to an evil empire, out of all proportion to their numbers. And we see this play out in human culture all the time, because if you think about that field of consciousness, it's not one man or woman, one psychic vote. You have more influence and more psychic votes if you have more energy and you have more uniqueness. So if we have 1 billion people all chanting Allah at the same time, they don't affect the field of information individually very much at all, because they're all interchangeable in a certain sense. Like if you think of 7 billion computers networked together, well, if 1 billion of them all have about the same programming, they don't affect the field of information very much in spite of their number. But if even just one computer has a unique piece of information, well, that affects the whole field of information, because now that information actually exists, even if it's only on one computer. Now, individual mutant, I use the example sometimes of Jimi Hendrix. Here we have a kid born in poor circumstances, his family has no connections or wealth, but because of his uniqueness and his vitality, and his being able to turn his unique energetic signature into searing electric guitar chords, well, he's affected everything. And even though he's been dead for 30 or 40 years, his music has never for a single second stopped reverberating around this whole planet. And each of us is a little bit different because he existed, because we've all been to some extent influenced by it. So this is how, through cultural memes, unique mutants can affect things throughout. And even if it says in the I Ching, for example, from texts from thousands of years ago, the right person thinking the right thoughts may affect things thousands of miles away, but even more for people in the same room. And so we are all affecting that field of consciousness. And that's why mutants who often feel highly oppressed by the military-industrial complex should also take heart and realize that fewness of numbers does not discount their power. But it does also help to have greater numbers. And that's probably one of the reasons why one of the great explosions of novelty we've seen in most of our lifetimes, I'm assuming most of us are probably baby boomers, is the 60s. And one of the things that really helped that get started was the baby boom, that demographically, the young were a higher proportion of the population, and therefore they had more psychic power. The young often have more psychic power as a sector of the population in general, because the youth has high vitality, and only very conscious people are able to retain that vitality to any degree. But also, if their numbers are increased as a proportion of the population, well, that boosts their power too. But then within that large group of young people, there are particular ones, a Steve Jobs, a Jimi Hendrix, or whatever, who influence it all the more based on their uniqueness and original thoughts and so forth.
Wow. Lots of good stuff to think about. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, Jonathan. We really appreciate you being here with us. And Uranus Rising has 2 questions that she'd like further to explore.
Jonathan, I'm really interested in what you term homogestalt, where odd individuals with intense skills and liabilities group together to form a group organism with a telepathic bond. Could you describe in detail, especially what you see as possible skills they might bring or liabilities they might have, and why you think this might be an evolutionary step? And if you think this might be a template for the larger collective?
Sure. Well, I got the phrase homogestalt from the great science fiction writer Ted Sturgeon, who wrote a novel called in the 1950s, I think, called More Than Human. And in it there was this homogestalt. It was maybe like 6 or 7 mutants, And one of them was like the executive function and made the decisions, and another was like the empath, and so forth and so on. I don't remember in detail all the different roles they played, but they had specialized roles, and they formed this symbiosis. And it seems like that's what we have in regular society, right? I mean, that we have a carpenter, a candle maker, a butcher, and so forth. We as society advances, we become more specialized, and we have all these different people who play specialized roles, and there's a lot of novelty involved in that, and we get a much more differentiated structure, because if we're all generically playing the same few roles, like in a hunter-gatherer society, maybe there's only like 4 or 5 subspecialties, but in our society, there's 30 different medical specialties and 20 different kinds of lawyers and all different, a million kinds of artists and so forth. And that's all part of the rich novelty and complexity of our lives. And we're doing that already. I mean, what is the internet but a whole bunch of different people who've specialized in different things all networking together? And it's not surprising that technological evolution would model the organic evolution that created it. And, the most densely interconnected, because another aspect of novelty is density of interconnectedness. And this was I first heard about novelty in this sense through Terence McKenna, who got the idea from the British philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead. And so novelty is the creation of new forms, but also density of interconnectedness. Now, what's the most novelty generating organic form that we know of? It also is the most densely interconnected object that we know of, and that's the human brain. Well, it shouldn't be surprising that organic form would also create the most densely interconnected physical artifact we know about, the internet. And so if we wanted to increase the density of interconnection, if we were all in a telepathic network together and didn't have to depend on little mouth noises to communicate, well, then now the density of interconnectedness has just wildly exponentiated.
Do you think that we're relearning this group telepathy through our use of the internet?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I've said, I think it's more the norm in nature. So it's in some ways, this is why Terence, wrote his best book is called The Archaic Revival. Some of the things that we're doing, I would phrase it a little bit differently than he did. I mean, some of the things we're doing are rediscoveries of things that we had in the past, like sustainable agriculture and tattooing and body piercing. I mean, these are old forms that are coming back into vogue. But I think that the theme of our time is the hybridization and mutation of past and future, of techno-shamanism, of bringing the Paleolithic and the futuristic and high-tech together, of East and West, of bringing all these. It's not of returning to the past like a kind of green anarchist or who wants to go back to have everybody living in something like a rainforest tribe again. I think that's regressive and counter-evolutionary and naive. I think it's about a hybridization of past and future, and remembering the future, remembering the past, bringing all these different aspects together.
Well, I love that term, techno-shamanism. That's wonderful. And my next question is, do you see that this process of metamorphosis has begun in earnest? And do you think it's going to take a while to get through the process? I mean, years, generations? Are we on the cusp?
Well, these are some of the $64 billion questions. And obviously, there is huge metamorphosis happening on all kinds of different levels. We see most dramatically with technology. In some ways, the human form seems to lag behind the speed of technological change, but technological change is also creating organic change. Our brains are being rewired. We're becoming far more visual. Hemispheric, the dominance of the left hemisphere may be changing now because of the increase of visual technologies. And but the idea of being on the cusp, this is what's tricky. I mean, when I was first looking into this, I assumed it would happen in my lifetime, but I also have egoistic reasons for wanting that to happen in my lifetime. Everybody thinks will happen in their lifetime. Like we mentioned, the book of Revelation clearly scheduled to happen in the 1st century AD, but people still think it's current and still assume it's going to happen in their lifetime. But so did the Millerites, who thought it would happen in 1860, and so on and so forth. We have more credibility for being on a cusp because the rate of change has accelerated. We have more wildcard variables than we've ever had before. We have more magical technologies than we've ever had before, but we really don't know. And there may be many lines, there may be many parallel realities. That's even supported by the majority of physicists, the multi-worlds hypothesis. This may be playing out in an infinite number of parallel scenarios, some of which it comes sooner and some of which it comes later. For example, someone who it really is writing about the singularity archetype without calling it that, the French Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin, in his book The Phenomenon of Man and so forth. And he talked about the omega point and the noosphere and so forth. But he actually saw it as something that might take thousands and thousands of years. He wasn't a typical millennialist, or where one of the things that apocalypticism and millennialism seem to have in common is people like to predict something that's going to happen within their expected lifetime. That's why people are excited by the Mayan calendar. It's conveniently close by. Isaac Newton, rather unproductively, I think, spent the last decades of his life obsessed with New Testament prophecy and so forth, and he came up with a date of 2050. But that date isn't sexy because it's too far away. For most of us, it's not within our expected lifetime. Nobody wants to have to wait 40 some years or something for that to happen. But if we're still around in 2040, I can guarantee you that there'll be movies coming out called The Newton Code, and everybody will be talking about what Isaac knew and so forth. But right now it's not a sexy date because it's not close enough. So because we have a very powerful motivating force for wanting to believe we're right on the cusp, I have to be wary about thinking that. And so I think we just don't know.
Well, that's interesting. And maybe we're on a series of cusps, so we'll keep that space open. Thank you very much for your honesty on that. Very helpful, actually.
Right. And in the scale of an individual lifetime, which is what the scale we're all on, we are definitely on the cusp because we are guaranteed that event horizon of death, which I look forward to immensely.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And speaking of new topics, something that you can introduce all of us to, if you would please, Jonathan, is your concept of dynamic paradoxicalism.
Okay, well, this is a little philosophy I came up with, and it was really provoked by a particular relationship. A very person with like high potential that I was working with and traveling with, and had a high will toward consciousness, but he was a true New Age fundamentalist and was absolutely rigid with like his belief in you create your own reality and so forth. And it made me very conscious, and it couldn't make progress with him past a certain point because he was an absolutist. He was just as much of an absolutist as an evangelical. And I started to notice, become more aware that how the human tendency toward absolutism and toward taking these extremely one-sided positions on things. And I wanted to come up with an alternative to that. And so dynamic paradoxicalism is based on the idea that the opposite of a profound truth is another profound truth. That when we really get into the essence of many key things, we find that sort of paradox, and that what we need is a dynamic or sliding relationship between the poles of the paradox. So, for example, you create your own reality is a key reality formation principle. It's one of the most powerful reality formation principles that we have. For example, if I'm going to a party and I think that people are going to hate me, or I think that people are really going to like me, that's probably going to drastically shift the reality I experience there. In that situation, that pole of the paradox really pertains and is quite powerful and relevant. But if I am a Jew in Warsaw, Poland, and the Nazis are about to come to town, well, from the point of view of New Age fundamentalism, trying to escape Warsaw and get to a more friendly country would be a capitulation to negative thinking. Instead, I should focus on how well I'll be treated by the Nazis, and then that will happen, according to them. But there, that may not work out so well, because I'm dealing with larger forces where my individual psyche has less influence and may be rather irrelevant in a case like that. So the other opposing principle to you create your own reality is outer reality creates you. And there is far greater evidence of that principle. Like, for example, we're all speaking English, but none of us invented English. Our psyche's booted up into a matrix of English, and the way we perceive time and ourselves and all kinds of things is influenced by the syntax and the vocabulary of English. And yet none of us created it. So that was a case of outside reality creating us. And when it comes to macro geological events, I don't think the citizens of Pompeii all had a common neurotic complex that created a common reality where they all had to be, covered by volcanic magma for some common psychological reason. That starts to look pretty preposterous and even morally reprehensible, because it can be a convenient way to explain why, a continent of people is dying of famine, and, they created their own reality somehow. It's their karma. What dynamic paradoxicalism does is it embraces both of these principles and sees them in a paradox pair with each other, and then suggests having a dynamic or sliding relationship between them. So sometimes it's much better for me when I'm writing my fantasy fiction to assume I create my own reality and subcreate these worlds and so forth. But if it's raining outside, rather than assuming my mood will change the weather, I should probably just bring an umbrella and surrender to the elements of outside reality are beyond my control. And it's good that they are, because if we could all create our own reality, then suppose some deranged person wanted to change the orbit of the Earth, which seems to have a clockwork accuracy outside of human psychological control. And so sometimes I'll want to have the transcendent view and see the whole paradox together. But sometimes it's better for me to be more in touch with one side of that paradox or the other. And in dynamic paradoxicalism, I discuss a variety of these different things, like the need for individual inner independence, but also the need for interdependence and to bond with others. Sometimes it's better for me to be in seclusion and working with what's inside. Other times to be in communion with others and sharing with them. And by not having an absolutist point of view, one has more free will, because one is able to slide between these different poles of various paradoxes. I'll just say one more thing about dynamic paradoxicalism. You could sort of see it as my version of Taoism, and where I see a certain flaw in Taoism, even though I'm more influenced by Taoism, but I'm much more influenced by the I Ching, which Taoism is based on, and I think is a more complete even than Taoism. The way that it's different is that if you were to bring in something like Aleister Crowley's True Will, it's sort of like dynamic paradoxicalism is the more introverted version, and Taoism is more the extroverted version, because in Taoism there's sort of a tendency to believe you're always adapting to outside circumstance and so forth. You're surfing the waves. But an aspect of the Tao that is not in the outer world and is more important than what might be going on in the outer world is something like what Aleister Crowley called true will. And that's like from your essence, your sense of your mission and what you most need to do. And that's the part of the Tao, your inner refraction of the Tao, that you should be following above any outer parameter. And so based on your true will, you might be going against outside circumstances. So like George Bernard Shaw once said, I might be paraphrasing slightly because I don't remember the quote exactly, but he said, for the reasonable man adapts himself to the world he finds himself in. And that sounds a lot like Taoism. The unreasonable man expects the world to adapt itself to him. Therefore, all progress is made by the unreasonable man. And so the dynamic paradoxicalists could be both the reasonable or unreasonable man, depending on where they were with their true will.
Okay, no, that last bit really helped me to understand what it is that you're bringing across, even though I'd read the book. Obviously, I need to go back and read it again. We're speaking with Jonathan Zapp. Please help support him by visiting his website, zapporacle.com, and truly consider purchasing a copy of his book, Crossing the Event Horizon, Human Metamorphosis, and the Singularity Archetype. I've been reading it, and it's fascinating.
Okay, I just wanted to mention to people that one way they can support my work and also benefit from it is I have several services which are thoroughly described in the services section of my website, like dream interpretation I've been doing for 30 years. Also I'm a generalist, which is what Jung believed in. I just do generalist consultations on almost any process. I also do creativity coaching. I've got a philosophy of relating to the creative muse. It's an essay on my site called The Path of the Numinous, Living and Working with the Creative Muse. And amongst the creative arts, I also specifically am a creative writing teacher and worked as an English teacher for 14 years and have a graduate degree in creative writing, also an editor. I do some writing and photography for people as well. So those are some of the services I provide. And another service that my website provides is the Zapp Oracle, which is an oracle with about 660 cards. It's growing all the time. It's a free oracle. People can consult on any subject. And they can also consult me about oracle readings. And I also do I Ching readings for people as well.
Wow, terrific. Definitely. Listeners should go to zapporacle.com and explore what he's got in terms of content as well as services. For many people, maybe more so in recent times, we've felt and or are observing the singularity archetype and believe it to be approaching. We'd like to turn the conversation now to our final topic area, the event horizon. And the first question will be from Green Meadow.
Hi, Jonathan. I actually have gone to your Zapp Oracle, and I really have been enjoying it. So my question is what happens when a predicted event horizon turns out to be a fail? For example, it was widely believed that Christ would return in the flesh in the year 1000. Peak oil and Y2K are other failed predictions, or at least for now. The year 2012 is probably going to be another fail. Is there an expected pattern to failed event horizon predictions?
There is. The failed predictions are always made by people who show all the signs of archetype possession. And because they're possessed by the archetype, they don't have a conscious relationship with it. They don't understand that it's an archetype and that it is ubiquitously present. It lives outside of linear time, so it always is imminent. It always is present. And therefore, they've confused inner and outer. They've projected it into the outer world. And so far, everyone who's done that has been wrong. Eventually, somebody could be right, just because eventually things will end. But they show all the classic signs, the warning signs that they're often an unreliable relationship to the event horizon, because you see those things we talked about earlier of ego inflation, of intense identification, messianic fervor, a feverish desire to proselytize, and so forth. And they will also take cultural artifacts like the whole Mayan 2012 thing. This is a subject I write about. People can read an essay and podcast on my site called Carnival 2012, a psychological view of the 2012 phenomenon and the 22 pitfalls and blind spots of esoteric research. The Mayan calendar doesn't end in 2012. Like all calendars, it just rolls over. It's perpetual. The Mayans have no prophecy about 2012. And whenever you hear people say, according to Mayan prophecy, they have no idea what they're talking about. The only reference we've ever found to it is in Tortuguera Monument 6, and it's pretty ambiguous what it even means. And so people will take cultural artifacts, twist them to be convenient to their apocalypticism or millennialism, or they may have cultural artifacts that actually predict particular dates, like Nostradamus saying the King of Terror would come from the sky in 1999, or Edgar Cayce talking about a ring of fire that would engulf the country in about the same time period, and they totally failed. So this is going to keep happening, and some people will cause harm to themselves and others while they're possessed with that archetype.
Yeah, I'm seeing people make a lot of decisions preparing for one thing when really what they should be preparing for is life continuing on. Right,
and rather than thinking about the rapture, they should be, not eating so many Hot Pockets and pork rinds and the trashy American diet and this kind of thing, because that's likely going to have much more to do with their event horizon than what their preacher said.
So is an event horizon only an inner phenomenon, or do you think cataclysms have happened in our history?
Well, absolutely. It's an inner-outer phenomenon, and it's so like death. Is death inner or outer? Well, it's both. People have near-death experiences, have this intense inner experience, but it's sort of inner and outer blur once you go deeply inside. And it can be outer in the sense that when you die, that's an outer event as well. People will be aware that you don't have a working body anymore. And also on the outer plane, all kinds of very, in a sense of astronomical time, commonplace events like giant asteroid hits can sterilize all the life on the planet. And so there are many game over scenarios, plus the many that we've invented, like, nuclear weapon scenarios. A very likely one would be a huge solar event, like the Eddington or Harrington event that happened in the 19th century, where there was a huge flare from the sun, and it created so much plasma and so forth that it disrupted telegraph systems and so forth, and would wreck all of our non-hardened electronics, which most of them aren't, and then that could cause a lot of nuclear reactors to all melt down at once. So we'll have 60 Fukushimas going on at once. So that's an example of a relatively probable, hopefully it won't happen, but a reasonable, in a sense of probability, scenario where you could have a total rupture of plane event and everything we've become accustomed to could stop working. The whole time civilization has grown has been a time of remarkably stable weather. So it could be something as ordinary as Yellowstone erupting, which it's, past when it should erupt and this kind of thing, or the asteroid hit or so forth. So there are many things that could bring that outer event horizon without any willing suspension of disbelief or any bizarre fantasy situation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Uranus Rising has another question.
Jonathan, in reading your book, which, by the way, I'm a pig in pig heaven reading it, so I really appreciate it and encourage everyone to read it. Anyway, I was struck when you used the descriptor taken from the monolith in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey of a tombstone stargate to speak of the portal to travel through to Metamorphosis. Would you speak of this tombstone stargate, this death rebirth process in evolutionary terms as an event horizon, and especially why shock is a necessary component?
Sure. Well, I'll start with the last part first, and then looking at 2001 is a great endpoint because it brings all the themes together, and that's why I ended the book with 2001. And why is shock necessary? Because I was going to add to our previous discussion about all these game over events. They may actually be highly desirable. When you think about what was the greatest spur to evolution, well, it was probably one of the great spurs was the giant asteroid hit that's believed to have happened 65 million years ago, that, as Terence described it, flattened everything larger than a chicken. It was a devastating apocalyptic event that trivializes any environmental damage we could do, because it almost sterilized the whole planet. And yet it was in order to get new forms, you need punctuated equilibrium, biologists call it. It was the opportunity for mammals to come in and fill in the breach that was opened up by the death of the dinosaurs. And so we see this on the individual timeline, on the collective timeline, is that shock is necessary. And that's why we have rites of initiation that are powerful shocks. Somebody's given an ordeal poison or put in some nearly lethal situation, which will either kill them or cause them to grow up and out of the stagnation of adolescence. Not that adolescence is stagnant, but that if you stay in it, it is. And so you need something to shock you out of that into adulthood, which often doesn't happen in our culture. And that's why we have people that seem like ungracefully aging adolescents and have an adolescent culture, like What is People magazine, but like high school gossip on a national or international scale and so forth, because people haven't had a rite of initiation that's shocked them out of their high school mentality. And so we absolutely need those shocks. And again, you could discover that by writing a novel in which you're going to have high development. You're going to create shocks. And so a shock, one possible scenario that just to think out of the box is that if you have a massive nuclear war or an asteroid hit where you have so many psyches leaving the body with their will to live interrupted all at once, maybe that would be the thing that would be necessary to create the Homo gestalt or whatever.
Right.
And so the shocks are viewed, and of course shocks can be a good thing too. It could be benevolent ETs come and cure cancer and do all these things. It could be a positive scenario as well. But they're necessary to stir up the homeostasis, the dialed-in equilibrium that all biological systems look for. And that's why both Freud and Jung noticed that the psyche, the human psyche, is very conservative because it's a very fragile process that's threatened by all kinds of chaotic elements, and so it tries to hold on to an identity and hold itself together. And for every organism we know of, pretty much, homeostasis is mostly a extremely desirable thing. Your cat or dog will have a great life getting fed the same time every day, and it won't mind that at all. And your body would actually benefit from a completely consistent regimented routine with the same bedtime and consistent meal times and so forth. But it would lead to a boring life because the one organism we know of that doesn't benefit from a total homeostasis like that is the human psyche, because it requires novelty. Like the Dylan lyric, "He who's not busy being born is busy dying." The psyche needs metamorphosis to continue its development and evolution. It needs to evolve, or else it's homeostasis it becomes stagnation. And so this is true for the collective as well. But because the collective is like an unconscious person in a lot of ways, unconscious people need more powerful shocks. A conscious person could have a shocking dream or a synchronicity or an oracle reading and make changes based on that. That would be a subtle shock. But an unconscious person may need a disease or a tragedy, may need tragic magic, as my friend Rob Brezhny calls it, in order to have a sufficiently strong shock. And because of the lowest common denominator factor, the collective may need that kind of unpleasant getting hit over the head by a 2x4 type shock to grow. And then if we look at 2001, we see all the themes of the singularity archetype and the way shock works coming together. And, I'm hoping that people in the audience have at least seen the movie. The movie and the novel were written together. It was an amazing collaboration of two cosmic geniuses, Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke. And at the start of the movie, there is a monolith that appears, and a monolith has a connection to alchemy that Jay Widener has done an excellent study of that. I talk about some of his thoughts in the book as well. And it is an extraterrestrial artifact of a highly advanced species that has transcended the body. We hear about that at the end of the book. They have glorified bodies. They live as consciousness or lattices of energy at this point. And they have sent it as an evolutionary catalyst and to a group of sort of missing link hominids who have not done much with tools or anything like that. And when this object appears, it sends out some kind of vibration or in some technological magic way, it intervenes with them genetically. And now suddenly they realize these large bones that are lying around could be used as clubs, and they can kill animals and eat meat that they didn't figure out how to access before. And then we're seeing it all from the perspective of tribe of these, or clan of these hominids, and they've been at war with another clan that lives across a little brook or something. And now the enhanced ones have another skirmish with them, and now they're able to defeat them because they've learned to use these bones as clubs. They've learned weapons technology. And then in the last moment of seeing these hominids, one of them, the alpha of the group, throws a bone club up in the air in a gesture of triumph because they've defeated this other tribe. And then in a 24th of a second, 50,000 years or something of evolution gets spliced out, and that bone that we see tumbling upward becomes a bone white spacecraft tumbling through space. And actually, what we only learn from the backstory of the novel, I don't even know if it's in the novel, it might have been something that Arthur C. Clarke just talked about, I have to go back and check, but is that spacecraft was actually a doomsday machine, a nuclear doomsday device. It was a direct line from the weapons technology of the early hominids to this high-tech weaponry. They didn't make it explicit because Stanley Kubrick's previous movie was Dr. Strangelove, and if there were two nuclear doomsday things, it would just be too much. And but we see in that transition of the spacecraft and the bone, what's changed and what hasn't. We've advanced tremendously with technology, but as our territorial aggression is still there, and it threatens our continued evolution. And now we've advanced enough where we can map the magnetic field of the moon, and a magnetic anomaly is discovered. And when they go to that spot and do a little excavation, they discover a monolith. And this monolith sends a signal out to Iapetus, a moon of Saturn. In the movie, it becomes a moon of Jupiter because the special effects in 1969 or whatever couldn't pull off the rings of Saturn. And they send a spacecraft out, and the spacecraft actually looks like a sperm cell, if you remember from the movie.
Yeah.
And they send it out through space to find out what's going on Iapetus. And now there's a battle between two streams of evolution, artificial intelligence and organic evolution, because how the computer gets into a zero-sum game with the crew and kills every member of the crew except Bowman. Even his name suggests the primitive weapons technology of early hominids. And organic evolution triumphs in that case. And he travels to Iapetus, and when he approaches, it looks like a giant eye. And the eye is is one of the key symbols of the Singularity archetype. And the pupil of the eye turns out to be a giant monolith. But it's not a solid object. When he lands on it, there's sort of like an M.C. Escher inside-outside thing going on. It's a Stargate, and Clarke uses the phrase Stargate, which we hear all over the place now, but it was actually, 2001 was either the first or second use of it in popular culture. And now he has basically something that exactly parallels a near-death experience. He goes through this tunnel, and he has a life review. And it says, he starts retrogressing through the corridors of time. And I even in the book put side by side quotes from near-death experience, descriptions of the life review, and what Bowman experiences. And what's fascinating is the movie and the book both came out 2 or 3 years before Raymond Moody published Life After Life, which coined the terms life review and near-death experience. There was very little awareness, if any, of the phases of near-death experience when this came out. So it seemed to come right from the collective unconscious.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then, other phases of a near-death experience happen, like the autoscopic experience where you're seeing your body from a remote point of view, and he goes through the aging process. He sees himself as an astronaut, but then he sees an older man that looks like him at an older age. And then he becomes the older man, so that the ego is breaking down. He's losing his original identification. Then the older man sees a almost corpse-like extremely aged person who's lying on his deathbed. And now we see another monolith at the foot of the bed, and it's like both a tombstone and a stargate. And when he steps across the event horizon of death and he reaches toward it, the old man, again, this will be very garbled to people who haven't seen the movie or read the book. It looks like Adam reaching toward God in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. And now he becomes the Star Child, a spherical being with huge luminous eyes that's has parapsychological powers, has a glorified body, it can go anywhere it will, and so forth. So you see all the aspects. You see the event horizon as death and as eschaton and as evolutionary event horizon, all coming together in a single work.
Beautifully, beautifully stated. Thank you for that.
You're quite welcome.
Jonathan, while your book generally focuses on the individual experience or the collective species of omni-humanity, are there suggestions that can be implied in regard to subsets of larger society and or the species? Can you speak to the duality of the singularity archetype and the event horizon vis-a-vis emergent social trends in opposition to anchors of rigidity resisting the pull of the transcendence and transformation?
Well, absolutely. I mean, let's remember that New Age, even though we may often criticize it and look at its many stereotyped aspects, was a term invented by Carl Jung. And there are many mutant subcultures that are in many ways trying to move us individually and collectively toward the event horizon. So, and they may have pathological aspects too, but still fulfill that role. So, for example, some group of kids inventing a virtual reality computer game where they're networked together when they're playing WoW, World of Warcraft, and it's a networked video game where a kid in Korea is joining a guild with a kid in California. And this is very much like Logos Beheld. It is very much like entering the imaginal plane. It has many connections to the singularity archetype. It's a subculture that may have downsides, like they probably have poor health care and so forth because they're sitting so long and eating poor food diet or whatever. But it's part of that. And what happened in the 60s even is part of that, the rediscovery of psychotropics, where people can have sometimes on-demand encounters with the singularity archetype through taking ayahuasca or something like that. So there are many different subcultures and countercultural themes that play out and bring forward aspects of the singularity archetype in the event horizon, and sometimes in pathological ways too. Many of these people can become possessed by the archetype and it comes to consume them, but it's still part of that process of moving toward the event horizon.
Okay, well, that's been wonderful. Thank you so much. We've been speaking with Jonathan Zapp of zapporacle.com. Thank you very much for sharing your time and thoughts with us today. We hope the listeners have gained insights into the topics we've been discussing, and we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. The mysteries of the human mind are boundless as consciousness transcends physicality, person, place, and time. We, the members of Time Monk Radio, look forward and hope to anticipate what the future brings so that we may be better prepared for its arrival. While the past is important, we'll leave that to historians as long as its lessons have been learned. Chipper Dog, during the course of our interview this evening, has prepared a poem that he would like to read for you.
Etchings in acid tones. A mutant wave is jiggling on the wires in my head, sounding lights in massive colors in the word as it is read, singing in the brush strokes that some might have be dead as the fullness comes in circles like a jumbled wedding bed. We've been looking for a long time in the blindness of full sight, continuing in process as we live both dark and light, bewailing our involvement, as in terror at our plight, to learn by supposition, and as we sleep our dreams at night. Will won't work, when rushed waters unstill the deepest pool, and that is one more thing you cannot learn in structured school. The wavering reception is unpointed to and from a tool where heated moment grabs itself to commence its own tattoo. Mushrooms and the octopi both live complexity's fine touch. One hovered atmospherically above in current's clutch, another planted in the waters, and not rolling quite so much, to string states of sensual rhythms in a weaving, dancing flux. Namaste.
On behalf of Fox and all of the members of Time Monk Radio Forum, thank you, Jonathan. And in our tradition, may you and yours have many, many tasty pies to come.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome.
It's
Excellent.
been a pleasure talking and listening to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really amazing.
Okay, thank you, and have a great evening, whatever's left of it.